be shared with council on June 2nd. Of course, everyone is welcome to be at that council meeting. Talking this through with the city manager, ideally we would like to see 2 members of the committee be able to speak on this process and how the whole process went. All that being said, we do recognize there's a couple of, there's a separation within the committee. So ideally, we would like to have 1 member of each of those separate groups to talk. So during the course of this meeting, we would like for the committee to sort of think about who those 2 distinct individuals may be, and then the city manager would give them an opportunity to talk at the council meeting on June 2nd. All that being said, everyone has an opportunity to talk. There is public comment, right? So we're not diminishing everyone's ability to talk. There is public comment during the meeting. Jason?
What is the separation of groups?
Yeah, I'm a little hung up on that as well.
Man. There seems to be, just reading the emails, there seems to be 2 distinct separation within this committee. So we want to make sure the 2 individuals cover both potential sides of the spectrum.
So you can't articulate how you define the different groups?
But
Go ahead, Jeff.
yeah, just for me personally, I mean, I don't, like, I'm not prepared to identify a delegate, right? I think there's a continuum of opinions on this committee. I think that's sort of binary. For me personally, like, I'm not super comfortable with that kind of binary. You're either, thumbs up or thumbs down. I mean, I think that in the intervening 7 days, we've had some really helpful, questions raised, particularly by the academic members of the committee. I think eager to hear some resolution of those today, but can we just reserve the right to revisit that question of sort of 2 opposing viewpoints?
So, Jeff, I think you said it perfectly. So the intent was for me to put this on the table. I'm not looking for, someone to say, oh, let's do this right now. It's an option of how we could possibly proceed. If the committee isn't in favor of that approach, and again, it's just something that the city manager and I discussed this morning, that's fine. And maybe we just reserve the right to get to this point again at the end of the meeting, and then I could collect your comments. What I didn't want to happen, and this was my opinion, I didn't want to spring this on the committee at the very end of the meeting where people didn't have time to think about it and talk through and just sort of have it articulating in your mind so that you can provide feedback. So if we could, I'll just ask Jose at the very end of the meeting, we'll reserve 5 minutes for this. Yeah, Deanna.
I agree with Jason and Jeff. We're just going to make it transparent. The separations of group is obvious for ones that are for and against, but we're here based upon scientists and scientific data, and that's how this study should be conducted, based upon data, facts, not how we feel about one way or the other. And so I agree that we should probably not do that. I know the city manager wants to have one basically there for and one against, but I thought this committee was put together to come up with scientific proof either for or against if it's going to harm our bays or not harm our bays. And that's what the data should be based upon, not who's for and who's against. I'm on this committee because I could be a little biased because I am in favor of the Hillcrest area, but I'm here based upon facts and data, and that's what I want to see. I want to see that this model would be based upon that and not upon opinions or political beliefs. we need to get this right and do it right. I know this is a short period of time that we've been together for this committee, but I would think everyone on this committee wants this done right, and it should be based upon facts, scientific data, and not on opinions. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Deanna, I'll let David talk, and then I've got to.
So is this going to be in the form of presentation item, but you're going to have public comment as well? Or what, I mean, what is the form of the agenda item?
Yeah, and I should have led off with that. So this is a briefing. It's actually item number 11 on the agenda. It's individual consideration items. There will be public comment. I would imagine that would be before this. That's a whole general public comment. Again, it's hard for me. I can't comment on how the agenda is going to go, but it's item number 11, and it is after the public comment and after the consent agenda as
So
well.
this is, I mean, in past, when there's been a committee like this, there's been a group of committee members that have typically sat up on the seats while you and the professionals give a presentation. So you're asking for volunteers to do that. I'm happy to do that. I don't know that number is 2. I think, there's a diversity of opinion and experience in the group. And so I'll leave it up. It's your agenda item, it's your meeting. Pick whoever you want, but I'm happy to do it. I'm planning on being there, so thanks.
I think, just thinking out loud, I think it would be good to have, if any of the committee members are there, to sit up front and at least be visible, because you are part of the committee during the presentation of this item. And then the other thing I was going to say, Deanna, is this process to me has been fascinating, because it's amazing what the modelers present every day. And to your point, we probably should get started and get to the data and the presentation is what I was going to say.
Just a quick point. I think we have computational accuracy and trust in the modeling. So I think one aspect is to have that presented in somebody that's in that area. And then you have the people that are the marine biologist specialists, and I think that how that gets brought out and who you select, I think that it needs to be dissected by that, because there's questions on the model and people that do the kind of work, and then there's people that interpret and are best to interpret the marine biology side of it.
Thank you, Brad. So I think what we should do, so we've thrown this topic out. Everyone can think about it throughout the meeting, and we'll come back to it at the end. But I do want to make sure we give the modeler the time to present his information. Again, thank you all for being here. We appreciate it. With that being said, I'll turn it over to Jose, and he'll kick us off.
For this meeting, we have 2 hours and 30 minutes. We know that is limited. We can go up to 3 hours if needed, so that would be 2 p.m. So 2 p.m. would be the hard stop for this meeting, just so you know, and we can plan and allocate for the right timing for the questions. I will fast forward to the content because we have already taken some time in the introduction. The purpose for this meeting is twofold. Number one, there has been some updates to the model related to the vertical resolution and the nuisance-based salinity. So there will be some updates from that from Pradeep. And also the second part is the modeling results, now including the wind speed discussion, the flood simulation, and the propeller wash. Related to how we are allowing for questions is pretty much the same as the previous meetings. As Pradeep will be presenting the findings, if there is a clarification question, go forward with it. We want to have understanding of the information that is being presented. If there is a question more for the methodology or the strategy or the focus, or you want to put into question what is being presented, let's hold that up to the end of that agenda item, as there will be some time for QA in each specific point. As the rules of engagement, you already know this pretty much straightforward, but I just want to reinforce the respect item that we have over here. Let's respect all of the opinions we have. And let's keep this environment safe for all of opinions and have that diversity. Having said that very quickly, I will pass it over to Pradeep.
Good morning, everybody. All right. Okay, so Jose covered the agenda here. We'll talk through some modeling updates and then get into the scenario results. So maybe we could, before we get into the scenario results, we could have some questions on the modeling updates to get those clarified, but just recognize that we have a lot of material to cover today. So if you continue to have some detailed questions, maybe we can take it offline after the meeting or by email later. Okay, so a couple of minor refinements to the model. Just wanted to point out for transparency here that, we made a little bit, just so that like the results we're seeing today is from a different model run, not the one that I presented last week. We made a minor change to the dynamic withdrawal discharge, mainly to better reflect the DMR temperatures at the effluent. So that's really doesn't change anything substantively, as you'll see shortly. So that's pretty much everything else in the base model is going to be the same as what I presented last week. So just we'll get that out of the way here. So I'm going to try to see if I can move these.
I do have a quick question. When you adjust that, does that mean that your reference or baseline model that you are using to compare desalination changes? So you're updating your base model?
Yeah, it's a change to all of them. So meaning it's an input change that I have to carry through every single model.
Now, how does that impact the results we saw last week? So did you had to rerun everything?
I had to rerun, yes, I had to rerun the model. So everything would be an apples to apples comparison of what I'm presenting today. So,
Okay, but we have to be careful with comparisons to what was presented last week.
yeah, and that's the point of this, is to illustrate that it didn't change anything overall, like it's pretty much the same of what you saw last week. So, so this slide here exactly addresses Dr. Herska's question here. It's like, so how did this change affect your model predictions? It didn't. It was more a due diligence on our part to make sure that, we get everything right, like, even the very minor details of it. So that's what that update had to do with. So what you're seeing here is the USGS and NOAA USS Lexington locations. So the salinity in the middle panel is from the USGS station, and the top and bottom panels are the NOAA water level and temperature data. So essentially to address this concern, like, oh, you changed something, did that change any of the model predictions? The answer is no. The model's performance is pretty much the same as what it was last week, and it's very comparable. The error statistics and everything are right there at the USGS location. And it's also true for other locations, but I'm just going to give you a flavor on from Nueces Bay. You can see here again, like, really that you cannot tell anything apart between the two lines. So that it didn't really change a whole lot. It was more a very minor tweak to the model input. But since we had to rerun it, I just wanted to be fully transparent that, this model run has been updated since last week. So again, here you can see the error statistics and everything, virtually no difference between the two. They're practically the same model run as what we saw last week. So, okay, so now we'll get into the meat of the presentation. I just wanted to get that out of the way. So there were concerns brought up last week in terms of the vertical resolution of the model. We tested a new 20-layer model. So essentially, the 20-layer model had all other settings similar to the 10-layer model. The primary difference was the number of layering. So just as a reminder, the 10-layer model has up to 10 sigma Z layers with a nominal vertical resolution of 2.3 meters. We essentially doubled the number of layers to 20 Now it's got up to 20 sigma Z layers with a nominal vertical resolution of 1.1 meters. This is comparable to the resolution of the older port model that was built. So what this did do was it increased the number of active cells in the model from about 34,000 to about 61,000, right? So the significant increase in computational burden. And we'll go through some of these results on how these two models compare. So just, this is primarily to address, like, does increasing the vertical resolution change some of the findings that we saw last week, and do we come to a different conclusion in terms of the stratification effects, right? And so this is essentially a sensitivity to test that. Now, the 20-layer model was similarly run for the base case without desal and with desal. So we'll show like how it performs relative to the 10-layer model, and then we'll also see the change in stratification predicted by the 10-layer model versus the 20-layer model. So you get a flavor for, how sensitive those kind of determinations are as you increase the vertical resolution. So one thing I'll note, and I said this last week too, right? Higher resolution gives you more precise answers, doesn't mean it's more accurate. We have no data to verify it at that level of accuracy throughout, right, in the vertical profiles. So there is a certain trade-off that you get by increasing resolution to a point, and then you don't really get that much more benefit, right? And so that, to us, like, that 10-layer was probably sufficient, and we're gonna see what these results look like, and then you all can decide for yourself whether it is sufficient or not. Okay, so let's see here. So let's start with the validation results. Oh, I guess I didn't swap the slide out. The run did finish. So this was when it was mostly finished. We didn't have that last part updated. Because of all my struggles, I did try to make these lines thicker. I still can't read them. So, okay, there we go. So I'm gonna zoom in here so you can see how the model is performing. So the red line is our 20-layer model. The blue line is our 10-layer model. And let's make sure that the observed water levels are in gray, right? So it's basically behind them, so you can barely see it. So in terms of water level predictions, both models are virtually identical, right? Like the error statistics are very comparable between the two. You're not really seeing any consistent bias one way or the other for either of those models. So these, it's doing a pretty good performance of the water level. So this is at the NOAA USS stations like I showed before, right? So the middle panel is showing the depth average salinity predictions between the two models, and the data is from the USGS station. So if you remember where the station is, it's just south of the harbor mouth. So again, I'm going to zoom in here so you can see the details. Between the two models, very comparable predictions, and really not a whole lot of difference or separation between the two in terms of how they predict salinity, right? They're more or less on top of each other throughout the time period. And then again, in terms of the errors and everything, so keep in mind that this part is still not done. This part is missing in those error stats. But even just without that, like, I think they're both comparable in terms of their mean errors and root mean square errors. Same for temperature. No apparent bias or difference between the two model predictions. They're providing comparable predictions of temperature between 10 and 20 layers, right? And similar error statistics between the two. And again, I wouldn't read too much into these. This says the 20-layer model has a root mean square of 2. These are, to me, like very small differences, right? It's not like one is 1 degree and the other is like 5 degrees Celsius. So they're not really separating out from each other. Yeah.
Why would you expect differences in the average salinity of the water column if you have 10 layers or 20 layers? The differences could be vertical if you look at a profile, but if you take the average of the whole water column, you're averaging basically the same mass of salts.
Well, maybe not. Like, it depends on the profile of the temperature and and how well your mixing calculations are going on in the model, right? If you're, let's say like your 20-layer model is saying your stratification is too strong, then your temperature profile is going to look different, and that average could look different. So it wouldn't necessarily always, I mean, to me, like if both are of sufficiently high resolution, you'd expect the same results. But what I'm saying is they could be different if, if it is sensitive to that vertical resolution and your model is not resolving the physics correctly.
So in a CSTR, if you don't have any flow going on in your system, your comment is correct. But in a system that all the, there is a flow, changing the number of layers could actually change how those connections are happening. So the depth average could be changed over time by changing the number of layers.
We'll see profiles as well?
Yes, you'll see profiles. I'm not just comparing it with depth averages. I actually didn't put the half-molar plots into it. This one, maybe I don't. Oh. Thank you. Yeah. All right, so this is performance within USS Bay. Again, here, the predictions between the two models are very comparable. No apparent differences in the predicted water levels, in the predicted salinity, and in the predicted temperatures. So the two models are essentially like, giving the same mass balance overall, right? They're responding to the same set of forcings and they're giving the same mass balance. All right, so here are profiles. Now these are going to show, let me see here. So so this is showing the model performance against measurements. So what I should have put in here and I didn't are the half-molar plots, there's only one location where we have depth profile of salinity, and that one doesn't extend all the way down. If you all remember, that only goes halfway into the water column and all the way into Viola Basin. I forgot to put that figure in, but if you can look at the depth profiles in the next one, you'll see like the two depth profiles are very similar. I do have that half-molar plot, and I can put that in or send it around after the meeting. I forgot to put that into this presentation. My apologies. Okay, so this figure is an animation. So now we're actually comparing it with and without desalination discharge. The top panel is showing a depth profile. So this was a depth profile I wanted to show last week, and if y'all remember, this went only up to 8 meters, and that it turned out that was a plotting error, basically. So it was picking it from the deepest location. It just had a plotting error, and I didn't catch that before the meeting. But now this one actually, I constructed it for both the 10 and the 20-layer model. So the top panel is showing the 10-layer with and without, and I'm going to make sure that I zoom in and understand all these lines first for myself and then for the benefit of the group here. The solid line is without desalination. The dashed orange line is with desalination in both panels, right? The top is 10 layers, bottom is 20 layers. And you can see that in the number of dots that you see. Each of those are essentially cell centers for the model, right? And so what you're seeing here, because this is salinity, the surface salinity is typically lower and the bottom salinity is higher. And then you're going from Viola Turning Basin all the way from the edge of the inner harbor to the mouth of the harbor and then going into the ship channel, right? So you have profiles throughout at different locations. And the desal discharge comes roughly between these two locations, right? The outer inner harbor and the inner harbor central. So in between those two locations where the desal discharge comes, that's also where the NBPS power plant intake is located. So just to give you context and some geographical orientation of what these figures are saying. So these figures will run from these are for the summer of 2023. If you remember, that's a pretty dry period, that particular window. And so that's why I picked this window. And then last week, we looked at the tidal cycles, the spring neap cycles, and then there was one in the spring period, and then there was one in the summer period. I'm showing the one from the summer period here because that doesn't have any freshwater inflows. It's more or less zero overall. So this will be an animation, and what you'll see is this goes through a full spring neap cycle. So you'll see the discharge-related stratification propagate with an outgoing tide over the course of this, and then you'll see these lines separate in both of them, and then you'll see them come back together with the next incoming tide, right, with the ship channel and all the way in. So the idea here is the key question here, and this is important because this is what we've been looking at so far, is what is this difference in salinity, right, from the bottom to the surface? Now keep in mind that there is an exaggerated sort of effect very near surface in a very thin model because it's a sigma layer. The layer becomes thicker and thinner, right, depending on the tides and the water level. So there is always that artifact. I mean, a fairer comparison of this would be to take a depth specific, like top 1 meter versus the bottom 1 meter. In a lot of the comparisons that I'm going to show, I did not do that. I actually took the surface and the bottom. So if anything, it's a more conservative comparison, right? Recognizing this artifact, it would actually say like, okay, with this, here's the difference between the bottom and surface, right? And here's the change in stratification. But a fairer comparison between the two models would be to say like in the top, at the same depth resolution, what is the conclusion on stratification? But it was, as you will see, that it is not even necessary to make the point that, there are results between these two are representing the physical processes more or less on a consistent basis. And you'll see that when I run this animation. So I'm going to start this animation, and then we can go back and forth on this a couple of times if you have any particular periods of this that you want to
Quick
focus
question.
on.
Just confirming, what you're gonna show us is one complete tidal cycle?
Correct, one spring neap cycle, so 2-week cycle. Yeah.
The salinity equation you're using is a linear diffusion, right? So there's no precipitation chemically possible, right?
The salinity is conservative in the model, yes. It's not a reactive, it's not reactive, if that's what you're asking.
So if there was conditions that would lead to precipitation, there wouldn't be anything but at the bottom, likely. I mean, the very thin layer at the bottom.
What do you mean by, like, the salt concentration is getting so high that it's going to precipitate out in the water
Comes
column?
out of solution either
Yeah.
through other chemistry of the water.
Yeah, this model does not simulate precipitation.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is just, it would treat the dissolved phase only, and it'll stay, it's a conservative tracer essentially.
So it's without fluid motion, we should see a linear basis of salinity, a salinity increase. Granted, there's not a lot of depth here for that to happen. So we don't expect a lot of salinity difference just because of the depth is not terribly significant. But we have a fair amount of fluid motion.
Yeah, I think it's a very energetic, relatively speaking, the inner harbor is probably the quietest, but as you go closer to the ocean, it's more energetic. It's 50 feet deep, about 17 meters deep.
Yeah.
So I don't think you have like a tremendous amount of hydrostatic pressure to change conditions. So I think this is a realistic representation of how salt will behave in the water.
Okay.
So
Would this model indicate any ship traffic?
this one does not have ship traffic. So it is actually a very more conservative assessment of mixing. So with ship traffic, you'll see those results later. It's not that sensitive to ship traffic but we also only tested it over a 2-week window. So.
I see that you did the study for the inner harbor and also the ship channel, the turning basin, did you do the depth for the bay of Corpus Christi? Did you run them out for the depth of the bay of Corpus Christi? Or you just did the inner harbor, the outer harbor, and the turning basin? Did you do anything for the bay of Corpus Christi?
Yeah, we're gonna see figures in the bay, but those are just time series figures that I'm gonna show between the bottom and the surface, how the stratification changes for the rest of the bay. So it's coming up. The depth profiles are more relevant here because this is where you have the depth and where you're gonna actually see the structure of that picnic line, the density gradients.
What you say is not significant?
No, I'm saying it's coming up. You're gonna look at those results. Yeah,
We will see that later on the
yes,
slides.
yes.
All right.
All right, so let's go ahead and play this. Is it playing? Okay, so now you're seeing this moving with the tides, right? So the key thing to note here is the difference, how much of a separation do you get between the blue and the orange line in each of them, and what's that difference between the bottom to surface over the course of the tidal cycle. So as we go towards the end, now you can see that it's separating out and then it's coming back together, right? And that's with the moving tide. So I'm gonna do this again because it's a little hard to pick all of those parts. So this is sort of in the beginning of the cycle. You start to see that, so first of all, within the inner harbor, in general, with the desal, there is a separation in both of them, right? So you're seeing that both of them are predicting that higher salinity in between the with and without desal in the inner harbor. But as you get to the harbor mouth and into the ship channel, both of them are telling us the same thing, that, you know, they periodically that breaks up. It doesn't persist out, you know, and with the tides it changes. But the next important thing is, depending on the tides and the conditions, this effect, like this higher salinity concentrations that we're seeing here, it gets pulled out into the channel, and that's what you see later on in the tidal cycle here, right? So now you start to see that separation in the bottom, because that salt wedge is coming in the bottom. It's the tides are that's an outgoing tide that's pulling the salt along the channel, right? And so if you keep going, you start to see, like, this is when you see the most difference, right? So now with desal, this is sort of your maximum difference between the two. What is important is both of them are telling us that that impact is relatively the same. And that was my point last week. Is like, I think our resolution is sufficient enough with 10 that we're not going to come to a different conclusion. Now, if we had 2 layers in the channel, that would be a different story. But that's where, like, you know, beyond a certain point, that value for adding layers is not really that beneficial. Now, later on in the cycle, you're going to see that, you see that effect propagating even out to ship channel 2 now, right? So, and then the incoming, the next, when I say incoming tide, like it's a diurnal tide, there is an incoming tide every day. But we're talking about the spring neap cycle, where there is a very weak part and then there's a strong part of the tide, right? Depending on the lunar cycles. So that's really the bigger energy generator, because that's when your tidal amplitudes go up, right? The water level fluctuations are higher. That's what's going to cause that pumping. Okay, so now if we keep going towards the end of that spring neap cycle, now there's a spring cycle coming back in. Now you can see that this all getting pushed together so that it is moving in, and then these differences will start coming closer and closer. And by the time you get to the end of the cycle, it's completely broken up, those differences in both models. There's not, that vertical structure shows that, you know, that salt wedge has been mixed out. So.
Are you okay if I go?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the one thing I note is, I'm trying to figure out the take-home message here. One is that there is persistent stratification in the inner harbor. The desal increases that stratification, but there's this episodic stratification that results from the discharge moving all the way out into the ship channel, right? And so it looks to me like that periodic sort of stratification sticks around for maybe a week or so, roughly.
Yeah, like a spring neap cycle, exactly. So
yeah, which is important because that's plenty of time for hypoxia to develop. And we've seen lots of examples in other estuaries where, you know, stratification lasting 3-4 days at most, and hypoxia, you can have fish kills under those conditions. So it looks to me like at a minimum you're going to see issues, you know, along a good part of that ship channel, at least out to Station 2. I don't remember where Station 2 is. Is that roughly
It's
halfway across the bay?
A little more than halfway, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
That's at least the take-home message I can get from this.
Yeah, I mean, does the salt wedge go out to the, and we saw this in the time series plots that I showed last week too, right? You had those episodes and then it breaks up. So that's exactly what you're seeing here. This is showing you the vertical resolution of that. Go ahead.
Just in terms of the breakup of that stratification, you know, after whatever you know, whether it's a week or whatever that period is, I mean, what is our assumption about whether from a mass ballast standpoint or otherwise, what is our assumption about sort of baseline salinity in the bay over time? Even though that stratification is dissipating, the higher salinity plume is still getting dispersed into the bay, right?
Correct.
And that's happening on a recurring.
Yes, and that's an important question, a very, very good question. So if you go back here, sorry, we're gonna actually see that. When we were looking at that time series figures, if you remember from last week, what we saw, overall there's a marginal increase in salinity, right? And that will happen because you're putting more salt into the bay, right? You're concentrating the salt. You're not putting more salt, I take that back. You're taking fresh water out, so you're concentrating the salt, and that would increase the concentrations. And you saw that in last week's slides, and that effect it's consistent between the two models. So.
I had a question. Does this include both desal projects or just the Inner Harbor? And then if it does include both, is it
Both S and CC polymers?
Yeah, does that
Yeah, so the CC polymers is included only in the hypothetical worst case.
Okay.
So, and I did not run the hypothetical worst case with a 20 layer. That's essentially another 4+ day run. So.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Okay, so.
Excuse me.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Why didn't you run the worst case scenario?
Between last week and this week, this was done as the sensitivity analysis. We've already done the hypothetical worst case with a 10-layer model. So the goal here is to understand whether the findings or conclusions are significantly different between the two. And to me, like the 10-layer model is providing the same conclusions as the 20-layer model would in terms of the formation and breakup of stratification. And so we're balancing computational efficiency versus, you know, spatial resolution.
I guess the question I have is, would the city be running both at the same time? So that should include the worst case in this particular scenario?
We've done the worst case.
Polymers and the Hillcrest. So would they be running both at the same time? So in essence, the worst case would be relevant to this particular model.
We have done that worst case analysis already. So
have you shown that? That's basically, you've done it, but have you shown it?
yeah, we presented it last week, and I'm gonna
Okay,
yeah.
is it included into this week's?
Towards the end, we're gonna bring the worst case summary back, so
Okay,
you'll see that.
when will you bring the worst case to combine with this case? So the two in tandem.
We already did that last week. We're gonna bring it back again this
Two in
week.
tandem. You showed me this week. Last week, I didn't see the worst case, but this week I see this case. And so are you showing the two in tandem together?
Yes, for the 10-layer model, we will be seeing
When
that.
will that happen?
Towards the end, when we're summarizing the work, we're gonna.
Towards the end, after the June 2nd meeting, or?
Oh, I see. Today, we're gonna bring it all together and provide a summary. Sorry, I misunderstood your question.
Yeah, Lamont, you're gonna see it today in this right here in this meeting.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Could we see the boundary layer flow? I mean, get the velocity profile through this? I mean, we would see perhaps in a steady state flow, we'd see, if there's not a lot of flow, we'd see a bottom that has, you know, a boundary layer on the bottom, and we'd understand whether our cell is inside the boundary layer or outside. And I would think you would see that on these salinity profiles if there was some stratification. So do you have any profiles like that?
The longitudinal profiles of velocities, is that what you're asking for? I don't have one in the presentation, but we can include one in our report.
Do you know what the boundary layer thickness is under steady state with this?
Can you elaborate what you mean by boundary layer thickness?
So the predominant flow is in somewhat during tidal, but also steady state flow is from the power plant. So we're drawing from the ship channel and we're going over here. So with that as a steady state flow, there would be a boundary layer in any channel, right?
So you're saying like sort of a net residual flow? When you
No, I'm
remove the
talking
tides.
steady state flow. What's the velocity profile?
Yeah, but it's not a system at steady state. That's what I'm trying to understand. Like, are you trying to get at the residual flow, or see the tides are it's a time variable system. There is no such true steady state for this system.
I guess what I'm trying to understand is the depth at the bottom, right next to the surface, there's no flow, right? A very small amount in, there's less. So, you know, if it's turbulent flow, that's very thin. If it's laminar flow in general, you know, then it'll be very thick. So it'd be interesting to see maybe during this, just some slices through of the velocity.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have that for this presentation, but I can certainly include that in our report. Yeah, absolutely. So you're interested in looking at what that velocity profile looks from surface to bottom between the 10 and 20 layer model? Is that what you're
Yeah,
asking?
maybe say this real simply. If we had pipe flow, or let's say a trough like this, an open channel, and the velocity was relatively low, we're going to see maybe, depending on where the inlets and outlets are, most of the flow coming up here, and we got a dead zone down at the bottom. So in a case here where we've got fluctuation, but a predominant flow through the power plant, I'm wondering if there's very low flow conditions at the bottom of our channel. And it'd be interesting to understand if that's low flow, is that what we're seeing here? I would think the stratification in a bottom layer that isn't flowing, has a low velocity, would have a tendency to collect perhaps. But
yeah, I mean, I see what I think we can definitely provide the velocity profiles, but you're getting that information in these right here, right?
Yeah, this is a point of validation. If there isn't if there is a real demarcation in boundary layer, then you'd maybe want to look at it closer, but if there isn't, then fine.
Yeah, but I understand that you can include that in the final report, Pradeep.
Yeah, we can provide
that
velocity
included?
profiles in the report. Yeah, absolutely.
Next, on your content, do you have the nueces-based salinity ahead of the vertical resolution? Just keeping track of time.
Yeah, so this goes back to the question of like, are you showing outside, you know, at locations outside the ship channel? Yes. So we're going to look at 4 locations overall throughout. That's how I structured this so that we can stay on time. One would be from the central inner harbor, so that we'll look at the bottom minus the surface with and without decel. That's sort of our estimate of stratification, right? That's how we looked at it last week, so it's going to be consistent with how we did it. The next is going to be at ship channel 2, should be here, and then we're going to look at Corpus Christi Bay front, which is a shallow location, and then USS Bay 2, which is another shallow location, right? And so USS Bay 2 is where that'll show the influence of the power plant discharge. So that'll give us a sense for, you know, does the 20-layer model give us like a different sort of discharge into USS Bay, and do we see a different conclusion within USS Bay? And then, you know, the rest of them will essentially tell us, like, you know, are we coming to a different conclusion? Okay, so see, these are the, I'm going to zoom in here. All right, so the top panel here is going to be the salinity difference, bottom minus surface. So that's an estimate of the stratification, right? Sorry, the top panel is just the bottom and the surface, so 2 lines. So the bottom salinity and the surface salinity. Difference between the with and without scenarios. Well, let me just go through the left column first, and then I'll go to the right one. So this is the salinity difference with and without desal, right? So the blue line, so the blue line is without desal, and the red line is with desal, right? So if you see a bigger difference, that means that the stratification from desalination is higher. That's what that is telling you. And then all these gray lines here, this was not there last week, I just added it to make our figures even more complicated. But the reason I added it is so that you can see sort of the tidally filtered water levels. That gives you the tidal signal of when that spring neap cycle is happening. And then the very faint line that you're seeing in the background is the tidal amplitude, right? That's sort of like the tidal range for that day. And all of these are relevant in terms of how water moves in and out of the bay, and also how much energy you have to mix things up, right? So that's why we put all of that as background information, so we can kind of, interpret the patterns once you have all of them together. So the middle panel here shows the same information, but as density. So density is a function of both salinity and temperature, right? So it's calculated from salinity and temperature. And then the model doesn't simulate density itself. It simulates salinity and temperature, but it calculates density internally. And we're using that same equation to calculate the density from the model outputs. The bottom panel is really your change in stratification, right? So this is, if the base case shows a stratification of 2 ppt and without this desal, and your scenario shows a stratification of 3 ppt, what is that difference? So it's going to be 1. This will show it's a difference of 1, right? So what we're looking for is, this is really our impact from the desal. What is the impact to the stratification? More positive it is, the stronger the stratification. The lower it is, the weaker the stratification change, right? So we're also showing it as density. That's the green line, and the purple line is kind of the purple line with orange shading is your salinity difference. Okay, now we have the same panels left and right for the 10-layer and the 20-layer model, right? So what we're looking for here is, are we seeing an appreciably different structure of stratification or change in stratification between the 10-layer model and the 20-layer model, right? What generally finding, so at a very high level, these scales should be consistent between the two, or mostly comparable, even if it's not exactly the same. But let's make sure of that. So this goes from 0 to 8. Yeah, this goes from 0 to 7. So this is maybe slightly shrunk. But it's, and then the bottom panel is also very important. Goes from they're about the same. Actually, they're exactly the same, the bottom panel. So what we're looking for is, where we see separation between the two, are we seeing separation? Then overall, like, do we see the changes in time that is relatively consistent between the 10 and 20-layer model? And then the bottom panel, is one showing a stronger impact than the other overall, or are they about the same? To me, when you look at this, the periods where they set up and they break up are all pretty consistent. So you see the same patterns here, the setup and the breakup. Around July, you see a second one that happens. And then again, that in late summer, late fall to early winter, again, you see a breakup period here. And these are all in the inner harbor. This is actually even more apparent as you go farther out. It's just, it's so noisy here. It's harder to tell. But in general, I think the timing, the magnitude, and the sequence of the formation and breakup of stratification are pretty consistent between the two models.
I was curious on looking at the 10 and the 20 layer. The 10 layer, just pick the top 2 graphs, for example. You're starting out at 0, you're reading 0 on the 20 layer, and on the 10 layer, you're reading starting out at around 2.25. Why are those different when you're just increasing?
Yeah, actually,
resolution?
the first a few, I would say, like, you probably want to disregard the first couple of months because we don't have like a good warm start initial condition for the 20-layer model. It's basically a cold start. And it's-
They're not aligned in dates. So the one on the
Or-
left is starting sometime in, or mid-May, and the other one's starting in March.
Oh,
So you have to
oh,
shift,
thank you.
so you
I
can
didn't
compare
forgot
May to
the
May,
M and
June
A
to
and-
June.
Yeah,
There's
I
an
got
error
that
there.
totally threw me off. Oh, the dates are different too. Thank you for catching that. Actually, the initial condition is also relevant too. Like we don't have a 20-layer warm start, so it's a cold start too. So that is probably an artifact in the very first month. That's why I didn't show January. I thought that's what that is, but you're right. The timeline itself is different. I need to. So if we shift it, like, if you can shift this to the left, then it should line up with this one.
Yeah, in both cases, the model, you don't have data, field data at all of these depths. You're making an assumption or you're taking some boundary condition to both the 10 and the 20. And those should be the same, right? Or no? I guess I don't understand your rationale for saying that the initial conditions are different for the two.
One is a warm start. Like for the 10-layer model, we ran it earlier and then we did a warm start of it. But for the 20-layer, because of the time, it's just.
But like you say, once you align these up, they're the same, right?
Yeah, I mean, like that, the initial condition should go away pretty quickly in any case.
Okay.
Yeah.
And secondly, while we're on the boundary conditions, when I was reading on the difference between HICOM and what was it? Baycast. It didn't seem rational about what you did, and I was wondering about the ratios that you come up with. It's common to try to match results, but you've got to have a rationale for doing that, and you had different factors you were applying. So the word we commonly say is you're fudging to get to there.
No, I'm not. No.
No?
No, that's not a fair statement.
Well, HICOM's for you pointed that, for offshore, and Baycast was developed for the Bay, so you're going with that and then applying different ratios. What's the physics rationale for that?
So we essentially looked at, and I have a figure here to address exactly that question. Can you hold on to that question? We'll get to that.
Sure.
Because we'll address that question. I have a backup slide to talk about that.
All right.
I don't want to get through these first. So, yeah.
Just real quick, so just trying to take the take-home message from this again. It looks to me like with the desal, you do get an increase in the stratification at this site. And the other thing I'm noting from this is it looks like stratification without the desal, it breaks down in the fall, winter, right? When you have the winds come in and fronts. I mean, that's, I think, what figure, or the second panel is showing, basically, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and so with desal, it looks to me like that period of stratification is now prolonged into the winter time.
A little bit, yeah. I mean,
Essentially,
definitely.
so-
I mean, we have a nice summary box plot that shows that
Okay.
exact what you're getting at.
Okay, so you've got extended spatial coverage of stratification, at least in the ship channel, and then you've got an extended window of time when stratification may be apparent because of the desal plan, right?
Yeah, in general, the effects of stratification you predominantly see within the ship channel.
Okay.
Within the ship channel is generally true, but more so in the inner harbor than outside the inner harbor. So, and that's what, throughout you'll see, like, when we're trying to pull all of this together, what does it mean spatially? Where are the impacts? What is the duration of that impact? That'll get at exactly what you're getting at. And there's a summary slide coming up towards the end. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the ship channel now. So we're farther out, now getting back to Dr. Wetz's point. How does it break up more frequently, and how does that break up look like? And did I get the dates right on this one? starts at March, no, so keep that date discrepancy in mind, my apologies. Grappling with these hundreds of figures and dropping them inside is a challenge. Okay, so keep in mind that one starts in March, the other one starts, May, the other one starts in March. So you essentially have to shift everything to the left on the right panel. But overall, though, the patterns, you can see the same increase here, the noisiness of it, the formation and breakdown of the stratification with the tides. The magnitudes are generally comparable, so the scale is the same between the two. If anything, there are periods where the 10-layer model here is saying it's a little bit more stratified than the 20. So, overall, to me, like, the key message is still the same, right? Key takeaway from all of this is that salt moves along the channel, tides break it up periodically, right? And then it resets. Overall, there is more salt in the system, or it's more concentrated in the system, and you're seeing the effects of that. And
I do see differences in those plots. I mean, it's not that easy to see because of the shift in the time, and also the scales are not exactly the same. And yes, the large peaks or the large valleys are there, but there are differences. So, maybe running like a correlation or a residual analysis to see, how much of a difference you actually have would be important. They're not exactly the same.
So, yeah,
and you said this, right? That you actually, when you have more layers, how the flow
yeah, they're not,
and each layer is going to change.
100%. I'm not saying the numbers are identical, right? They are going to be slightly different. It is, at the end of the day, a numerical computation. And so there are going to be numerical differences, right? And so there is a component of it that is discretization related, which is what we're looking at right here. And is that the question that we're asking is that substantive enough to change our overall assessment of whether it's what the extent of stratification is, right? And to me, like, that summary is important. And when we see the summary, like, are we seeing a dramatically different effect just because we have a 20-layer model versus 10-layer model? So I think we need to keep that in mind. And you're right, and I do apologize for the shift in the scale. I did not catch that. I dropped this in late last night. So, okay, so same here for the changes in salinity and density at the Corpus Christi Bayfront. Now, this is a shallow location. Here, the water is not as deep. We're taking the bottom minus the surface, and we're comparing these same comparisons. Again, last week we saw what you saw on the left panel. Now we're seeing, possibly somewhat higher salinity differences, periodically, but you don't see it persisting. And to me, like, the more important thing is, the density differences between the two. Again, like we saw last time, there are a lot of negative values here too, and very small negative and very small positive values in both of them. If you were to run a statistical test, it probably is going to say that it's not significantly different from zero. But either way, I wouldn't really read too much into the small negative deviations in the positivity. That's just a shift in the timing, probably. So to me, like, this is not an indicator of significant stratification overall, right? And whether you're using the 10-layer model or the 20-layer model. So the effects are limited predominantly to the channel. Once you move out of the channel, those effects die off very quickly. And this is not that far from the channel, right? It's the Corpus Christi Bayfront. It's just south of the harbor mouth. And then when you look at it in Nueces Bay, the next figure here, again, like, the scale is really important here in terms of the stratification difference, right? It's less than 0.05 in either direction, say 0.1 in either direction, right? And that's true for both models. Now, there are very small, subtle shifts in timing and the extent, but overall, this is really just small numerical differences, not a persistent trend or pattern like you're seeing in the channel, where you are seeing stratification setup and breakdown over an extended period of time.
Sorry, just a quick time check. We have 15 more minutes for these first agenda items so
Yeah.
that we don't run out of time.
Yeah, so
That's
let's, I think this is pretty much it for the first item, and then, so let's get to the salinity issue that was brought up last week. So overall, so just let me close out for the 10 to 20 layer model. And there's a summary slide in the end too that'll bring this together. The vertical discretization fundamentally does not change our assessment of how, we are evaluating the effect of the stratification in general. Like if you were to take a 10,000 foot view of like what is the impact is predominantly limited to the inner harbor, and perhaps to the Corpus Christi channel. Most of the areas outside of the inner harbor is not that impacted, regardless of the vertical resolution that we apply in the model. Meaning that the 10-layer model is probably sufficient for the questions that we pose to it. And so the question about NUSS-based salinity, and actually those very high salinity values that we saw in 2025. First of all, I want to point out that our model domain stops here, right? So this is way out in the delta. And the discharge from NBPS comes out, the tanks roughly in this area, right? So roughly in this, it's maybe a little bit.
The little, go to the right there, right down, yeah, right there.
Yeah, all right. Oh yeah, right, the higher discretization in the model right here, yeah. So I was looking for the tanks and I couldn't see it in that aerial imagery, yeah, there. So, yeah, okay. So the key question that we're looking to answer is, if there is desal discharge here, and there is a power plant that is withdrawing it from here and putting it here, what is the impact in the Nueces Bay salinity overall, right? That's the science question we're asking. The Nueces Bay Delta location that was brought up last week, first of all, is well outside the model domain. So that's important to keep that in mind, right? So, and it's not going to be connected most of the time to what is happening in US Bay proper. Salt 3 perhaps is to some extent, right? Now we are validating our model to salinity data from both of these locations. Okay, so just want to make sure that everybody understands that it is validated to specific data within US Bay. And we saw earlier that regardless of whether it's a 10-layer or 20-layer model, we're performing very well relative to those data. So the next important thing is those high salinities, so maybe it's worth looking at what they are. So I just have shown a plot of all the locations here. Sorry, I'm also going to point out this location. This is not really relevant for anything that we're discussing right now. It's up in the tributary, but I just pulled all the data that was available and I wanted to just show what they all look like. So really the relevant ones are these three and the one in question, which was brought up last week, this one, the Nueces Bay Delta 2, okay. All right, so 2019 to 2026, okay, so we have, the blue here is the delta, the red square is salt 1, then the blue triangles, or the green triangles is salt 3, and then this one, the purple one, is up in the river. It's just shown for completeness, but really these three are the more important ones, right? Or really these two are the more important ones from our modeling perspective. So, sorry, there we go. So this axis here goes from 2019 through 2025, 26 really, basically I downloaded it this week, so through present for all practical purposes. So what we're seeing here is a pretty consistent salinity pattern within Nueces Bay over time between the green and the red locations, that's salt 1 and salt 3. So we have data, this is the data that went into validating the model. And the model performed quite well against this data. Then in 2025, they're still consistent up until this point. This is when the platform collapsed and we lost salt 1, right? And then we have only salt 3. And it starts to deviate substantially higher here, right? It goes from your typical values that you've been seeing over time. You never really see the salt 3 this high, right? Then it starts to go up to like 60 and 80. So the question is, how much do you believe that data? The first question. What is, is there a real explanation for what could cause salinity to be that high?
Well, you do have the other ones going up at the same time.
Which one? The blue one is Nueces Delta, yeah?
Yeah.
And that's not connected to the Bay
Well, not
proper.
in your model, but in real life, these things are going up.
Okay.
Together, they're connected.
Well, to me, that is telling one of two things, right? So it's either they're connected, something is happening that is causing the salt levels to go really high, right?
Well, in that shallow estuary, the evaporation is taking out the water and leaving the salt.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's it. That would be a plausible physical explanation for why you would see something that high.
And Nueces Bay is the same, and it's getting some of that perhaps from upstream.
Right. So, but the issue is, whether that is pertinent to the study. The question we are posing to the model.
Well, I guess what I'm sorry. My biggest interest in this whole thing is just this topic, that these small perturbations, it looks like it's having a couple parts per thousand impact, and that's expected from my closed form solutions. I think that's just fine. The question I've had is during these periods of extended, and all of a sudden we see these going high, and does the model predict that? Does it show it going higher during that period?
Yeah, so I'll ask the question back to you, is like, does the model have to predict that? What is the job of the model here?
Well, we're looking at do fish kills happen, and it seems like, I think historically, there's been these reports of Nueces Bay getting to this point. And so I think it happens naturally due to a lot of evaporation and low flows. That's just, predictable. But my question is, do we extend the period of those longer so that there's more fish kills? Does it go higher? Probably just a couple more parts per thousand, but in time, does it extend the concern period? That's my question.
Well, I guess my comment on that would be the permit at a 40% recovery has a maximum of 49.9 parts per thousand. So if you're getting above 50 naturally, doesn't the 49 help reduce the salinity?
Not from where you're taking it in, because you got somewhat of a closed system, because you're, as stated before, you're not really putting salt into the system, you're just making it saltier because you're taking the fresh water out.
Well, here again, if you've got naturally 55 part per thousand water and you're putting in 49.9 concentration from the desal plant, isn't that reducing the overall salinity?
Well, that's what the computational model does for us. We got interaction with a buffer solution that's at 36, and so are we by introducing, by concentrating it, we're making it saltier in general, that same closed body.
I want to bring us back to the question that we're trying to answer. The science question that we're trying to answer is, with and without the desal, what is the change in salinity, right? The science question that we are not asking is, what is the contributor of high salinity or these rapid fluctuations in salinity within Nueces Bay? That's a different science question altogether, or a modeling question for that matter. The second, more physical reasoning for that is, if in fact you have these isolated pools, right, that are concentrating the salt. Like, I don't know if that is the case here. I don't see like how, this can fluctuate so much, right? And so to me, like that is a little suspect. Now, there is a possibility that it can fluctuate that much. If that pool is isolated, you have a tide moving in and then it fills the pool, it dilutes it, it brings the concentration back down, and then it evaporates again and then goes back up. But for that, like, the amount of evaporation we're talking about in a short period of time is a lot of evaporation, right? So,
Well, with the time period I'm concerned with, though, like Mike said, a week and a half, you can have hypoxia. So I'm not, tides happen faster than that, obviously. So the concern is that this period shown by at least that one was extended over a period, I think, several months. And so if that period
where are
is,
you seeing that extended several months of high salinity? Actually, even if you do, like that would just point to like a completely disconnected area, right? It's not connected to the tides and therefore no longer relevant for the question we're asking, which is the discharge in Nueces Bay. That's not even getting there. If it was getting there, that salinity would have come down instantly, right?
right, so salt 3 was up here for a while.
Yeah. Maybe, if it was up there for a while, then it was not connected to the tides would be the most rational explanation, assuming that that data is correct, right? If it is not connected to the tides, the discharge that you're putting into Nueces Bay, farther out where it is more connected, is not even getting there.
Sorry, my recommendation would be to follow up on this conversation after the
Yeah, I think
meeting,
we need to
because
go.
if not, we won't be able to cover the agenda items. I think we need to move to the
Yeah,
next
but
one.
I do want to make the point here that, the model has been built to answer the questions that it was posed to. This was never a question that that was posed to the model to begin with. And I don't think there's a physical reason
Yeah,
to connect the two, but I'm happy to have the conversation.
I'm
with
just
you.
saying that this is important to me because the duration of a high salinity spike is the most important question to, is there more of a fish kill? So the duration of time and not just the spike. And I don't know how to get more data for that, but maybe you and I can discuss that over time. To me, this also validates the model that it's showing what happens in real life.
I just want to summarize this. There are three different explanations here. One is the sensor is bad. That's one explanation. The other one is this area is somehow disconnected from the rest of the system and the evaporation is so high. If that's the case, that means that the water that's coming out, or the brine that is coming out from the desal, is not going to even reach there. So that's completely irrelevant to the study. And then the third party is like, if for whatever phenomenon the salinity without the desal, because this is the real data, reach 60 or 80, the fish kill is going to happen regardless, right? Because if you have a salinity of 80, no one can survive in that, regardless of you have desal or you don't have desal. That's a separate issue, environmental issue that needs to be addressed by itself, but not relevant to this study.
To me, like that's the key. Is like I'm not saying that's not an important question. That's an important question on its own, but does adding this the question, the reason we're building this model is to understand what is happening within Nueces Bay when when there's a connectivity and this discharge is being put in.
Right.
In fact, at this point, you want this tide to reach there. It'll dilute it and it'll actually help things, right? It's the fact that it's not reaching is probably what is causing that, if that is a real data point. And so, to me, like, the model having to explain that is unnecessary for the broader questions that we're posing to the model. That's really my main point.
I disagree, but let's continue to get everything on the table. Maybe we can take this offline.
Yeah. Okay, so, all right, so let's look at, this is the 2021 flood condition. Actually, we're getting into scenarios. Okay, so those are all the sensitivities that we were going to explore and questions that were posed last week that we wanted to address. Now we're getting into the remaining modeling scenarios, and we'll try to get through these relatively quickly. So one of the requests from the committee was, if there is a big freshwater inflow event, how does that change in stratification look like when you have like this big runoff event? So this 2021 flood period was identified as one of them, right? So the top panel here is showing the Nueces River flows. Those are from 3 different gauges in the Nueces River, just to point out the timing of that flood, right? That's really the point of this graph. Both Oso Creek and Nueces River exhibit a pretty high freshwater pulse at, roughly in this period right here in May of 2021. So we started the model run 2 weeks prior in May, just towards the end of April. We let it run through this freshwater pulse and let it carry through 2 weeks after, right? So it's roughly a 1.5 month model run to see like how the salinity change. And for the purpose of this model, we used a warm start, like, Hazen and Sawyer ran a model, a long-term model, like, and then we took a snippet of that to warm start this model. Okay, so in the interest of time, and I thought we would probably not have time by the time we got here, so I only put in the stratification figures in all of this. These are probably the most relevant for what the questions you're asking. So what you're seeing here is with and without desal. This is the inner harbor in general, like, the bottom minus top. The slight increase, more than like it's a 1 to 1.5 ppt increase that we've already seen in the past, and that's still happening within the inner harbor. That shouldn't be a surprise because these freshwater inflows don't really make it to the inner harbor. So the change in inner harbor is relatively consistent, right? Like, you're not, Nueces River comes in Nueces Bay, that water will have to take a very circuitous path before it makes it to the inner harbor. Some of it will make it, but not to the same extent, right? So the change in stratification is comparable, like what we've seen before. It's in this case it's less than 1. About 0.8 is the highest that we get to. But the more interesting ones would be I'm going to skip the ship channel too. Like it's basically the same story. You have the formation with the tidal signals and so on. But the more interesting one would be in the Corpus Christi Bayfront, where that freshwater lens from Nueces could be coming out. You could be influencing the surface salinities there. Does that mean that our stratification is stronger? That doesn't seem like it. In general, it's the changes are relatively small. Maybe this pulse that you're seeing here is right after that event is the freshwater lens making it out there. But again, the scale is important here, right? It's still of the same magnitude that we saw, but without those freshwater events. Nueces Bay, very similar. You're still seeing that one pulse, a little after that freshwater pulse. But again, the magnitudes are really not that different from what we had before. So that freshwater runoff event, I think, was relatively short-lived. And maybe had it been like for a longer extended period, maybe it would have had a bigger effect. But it was easily assimilated within the system, and it didn't really produce a big signal overall. Okay, so the second question that we asked is, and this was a challenging one to actually find, run a 10th percentile wind scenario, and then what happens under that condition. And we said like 10th percentile wind consistently over a 2-year period is unrealistic. We'll try to find long enough windows where it is relatively calm. And we looked at these are all the met stations that are used in the model that provide the wind speeds. So we looked at all 5 stations. So the next figure here is going to show, this is what is called a cumulative density plot. It's essentially a frequency distribution of the wind speeds at each of these locations. So your 10th percentile wind speed would be roughly here, right? So that's about 2.5 meters per second, somewhere between 1.8 to like 2.5 meters per second. I'm going to show you the next figure, and then we'll come back to this. It turned out, sorry, this is a very busy plot, and the point that I really want to make here is, so what we're seeing here are the 24-hour moving average wind speed at each of these locations. That's that red line right here. It was a real challenge to find extended periods with wind speeds below 2.5 meters per second. That's really the point. It's like,
Would
it was.
Would there also be the question, though, of a high speed where you're pushing? Because some of those reports showed that wind was a significant factor, and I guess I'd have to go back and look at the report, but I thought that this was maybe a high wind condition pushing against and into the inner harbor in that direction. And I've heard from people in that area that the wind does seem to prevail that way, but that would maybe hold conditions. I don't know how it would push salt, but.
Yeah, so in general, you want more wind. More wind is good for DO. More wind is good for
Diffusion.
mixing things up, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, so when you have a high wind stress, the water, the shallower parts will mix. They are not going to show any stratification.
Right.
Now, if you have depending on the freshwater and saltwater conditions, it could push some of that freshwater lens into the inner harbor. It could make the harbor more stratified, but the issue really is like, I think this question was primarily coming from what is happening in the shallower areas, right? That's what this question is trying to address. It's like, can you find like periods that are really calm and then look at what the stratification is during those periods? And so I tried hard to find a period. I just couldn't find. So what we did was instead, we still found periods of relatively calm conditions, and that's really what I was getting at here. It's not so much that I didn't want to do it. I'm just trying to find what is a reasonably calm period. Then we took the 25th percentile. That's about this 3 meters per second or so, depending on the location. It can be anywhere between 3.5 to 3 to like about 4 almost, right? So 3.5 meters per second is about the 25th percentile, roughly. So it's a slightly higher wind magnitude. But there is a seasonality component to it too. Like if you really look closely, like, there are periods that are generally windier and there are periods when it's relatively calm. And so then we tried to tease out, like, are there long enough periods in these orange bars where we can like look at it for like, over a 2-week or 3-week window, and generally they're all relatively narrow. So what we did then is like, let's look at it on a monthly basis, right? What is our calmest month in terms of the wind speeds? So if you look at this, so this is essentially looking at the monthly distribution of calm hours, and calm is 3.5 meters per second. That's not, necessarily calm. That's a nice, pleasant breeze. When does that happen? So the taller the bars are here. So this is the proportion of time within the month, right? When you have that wind condition. It turns out that December is actually the best time. That's the calmest time in the bay. Like you actually have, relatively quiescent conditions, and you don't have very strong winds. December. So you can see here all these bars across the different weather stations. They're all showing more days with wind speeds of 3.5 meters per second or less. So what we then did was, okay, now we have 2 years of simulation. We have 2 Decembers when we can zoom in and look at, is the stratification in those months appreciably different or higher, right? So that's what you're going to see in the next series of figures. For this one, we actually are presenting from the hypothetical worst case, because that's the relevant one here. Under extreme conditions, if you also have quiescent winds, are you actually exacerbating your effect? Like that's kind of what we're looking at here. So this is from December 2023 within the inner harbor. In December, again, we're seeing the range of the stratification difference with and without desal is still within that same ballpark of 0 to 1, actually much less than that in this case. And then if you come to December 2024, again, very comparable overall, right, in terms of the effect. Nothing like, you're not suddenly seeing like a stratification difference of 3 meters, 3 ppt in December of either years. Then what about the shift channel? Similar patterns, with the tidal signals that we saw. Actually here you can really see that the period where it's quiet, you're starting to see that stratification set up. And then when it picks back up, it breaks down. So it's actually, you can see the tidal signals quite more apparently here in this zoomed in version. But anyway, that's that's a digression. But the main point is, you're not really seeing a bigger effect on the stratification for December. Same in both months, both years. What about the shallower locations? So this is Corpus Christi Bay. Actually, again, I don't know how much I want to read into these negative values, but really it's all like practically bouncing around zeros, right? Not really a big effect.
Just to give a little context, because I'm on the water a lot in the fall and even in the surf.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing is cold fronts. So you'll get a 24-hour period of high winds, usually out of the northeast, and then it'll calm and get sunny to the next one, and then the wind will shift. Maybe if there's enough period between to the southeast, which is our predominant winds here, and then another front will hit. So that calm period in between fronts in the winter and fall is probably what we're seeing.
Yeah.
Just my personal experience on the water.
I think it's important also for context to think about the magnitude of these values. Can you talk a little bit about what does it mean when you have like a change in stratification of 0.3, of 0.5, of 1? Because we do have, based on the literature, you can define a system, a shallow estuarine system, as being weakly, strongly, or very stratified based on those values.
Yeah, so generally anything less than, we're using a threshold of 0.5 later, right? And then 1 and 2. Once you're starting to see that 2, 3, 4 ppt difference between the bottom to surface, and if you're it tends to be relatively strongly stratified thereon, right? And further out, anything higher than that is going to be even stronger. Anything less than 1 or less than half is not that strongly stratified, right? Like less than half typically is, you wouldn't, very weakly stratified. The closer to 0 you are, the weaker it gets, right? And the importance of that weak stratification is that those are easy to break up versus strong stratification, which is more difficult to break up. You need a lot more energy to break that stratification up. When it's weak, a wind event can break it up, or even your routine diurnal tides can break it up, right? So that's really the importance of these numbers. Thank you for that question. So.
Do you have some spatial though? I mean, I think that those reports I saw were a big salinity difference between bays and saying wind was the most significant factor getting back to maybe even the high conditions. Do you have some, we haven't looked for a while at the plots of the bays and salinity. Yeah, so contour plots during this.
I don't have contour plots specifically for this event. I do have summary plots that shows the spatial extent of the stratification change.
No, I'm interested more in salinity because I don't think in these shallow bays there's enough depth to see that. But I'm more interested in interaction between the bays and seeing this on a aerial variance.
So how does this change aerially? Is that what you're asking? Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't have it specifically for this figure, for this particular analysis, but it's something we can.
You can plot out, sure.
We can plot and show in the report, yeah. I mean, you are getting a spatial flavor for this between these different locations, right? So that's why we're showing it in Nueces Bay, in Corpus Christi Bayfront, and the channel. So, and last week we showed even more locations from the shallow, and they're all like very comparable. You're not seeing like, way out near Portland or on the, on the south side near Karamu, like you're seeing a different signal, right? Like they were all relatively small in magnitude overall.
I guess what's been going through my mind is when you look at the buffer being higher, instead of thinking the salt flows this way, as we take fresh water out, we got this thin coastal area where the fish want to lay eggs, and it's our precious area. We're sucking from that. We're then putting back in. We're taking the good water out, if you will, putting salt in. And my question, I don't know the answer to, is do we decrease that precious lower salinity water along the coast, closer?
Well, that's an interesting question. So you're essentially looking at the habitat area, right? The usable habitat area.
Yeah, are we reducing the lower salinity, better habitat area? So if we could just see contour.
Yeah, I mean, just going by the differences that we're seeing here, those contours are literally going to be on top of each other. I can certainly create them. But
Yeah, my mind
just-
isn't
yeah.
good enough to take 2 points and make a map.
Yeah, well, there are enough points that I can sort of interpolate between
Okay.
them. But you're right, like, looking at it as a spatial distribution would be helpful, so.
Can we get on to the conclusions? I mean, column days are interesting, but they're few and far between in Corpus, and I have a hard time seeing how they materially impact things. I'd like to see the conclusions and have a time to talk about that.
Yeah, yeah, we can get to that. So this is within, in 2024, again, CC Bayfront, similar magnitudes. So I'm gonna go skip through these quickly. New SS Bay 2, this is within New SS Bay. Again, not substantive changes from, nothing beyond what we saw in the past with or without the, these wind conditions. Okay, so the last part is ship traffic. We did run prop wash this time around, and we have some results for that. So as a reminder, the dominant ship route is through the channel, Corpus Christi channel, going into the inner harbor. We actually, that's the route we picked, except that we extended that route further in. And based on the feedback we got from you, Jeff, last week, we essentially tried to bound it by simulating the largest ship transiting, coming in empty and going out full. We did this for spring and summer. I'm just going to show the spring results here. It's only over a 2-week window, so I think that it needs to be a longer window to realistically see an effect. So in the rest of the figures that you're going to see, like, the effect is actually pretty muted overall. So these were the different ship sizes we showed. So essentially, this shows the range of ship sizes, but really the more important one is this. So we did run a simulation with a small ship, which is about 7,700 tons, and a large ship, which is about 63,000 tons, right? So way bigger and has much larger impact. So this is the more important one, sort of the bounding test of like how much mixing you might get from ship traffic. I'm not going into the details of how we set up the simulation because that, my colleague who's online really dug into the different sort of nuances of all of the shaft length, the draft and everything, and the beam length, and how do you put all of that, and putting all that together. It's a pretty complicated set of calculations essentially to come up with that mixing intensity from the propeller action. So to me, so what this is showing is, again, from spring 2023, which you cannot quite see that, the effects within Central Harbor, that's where we actually saw a little bit of an effect at all from the prop action, more than other locations perhaps. But generally speaking, the change in stratification, it doesn't really go away, but this is where I wanted to I couldn't tell if the simulation was long enough to truly see the effect of that mixing propagate throughout the system. So maybe what we really need is a longer simulation, not just a 2-week simulation to correctly assess it. And then if you look at the ship channel again, the signals here really is difficult to conclude whether it's having a substantial effect or not.
So what were the assumptions about frequency of vessels?
Just one vessel going in and out. So yeah, thanks. That's an important question. So our assumption was maybe that needs to be grounded, whether that's realistic. We assume like an empty ship comes in the morning, right, and then a fully loaded ship leaves in the afternoon, and then we simulated that every day for 14 days.
Yeah, that's not how it works, nor is that a representation of the total number of vessels, even if you were going to just assume evenly distributed, which we talked about, right? You shouldn't do. Okay.
So what would be a reasonable number of ships to simulate? Because the numbers were so varied, it was really hard for us to
Yeah, just out of fairness to the rest of the group and time from here, I mean, we should talk more about this, but that was what we tried to capture is just to give you a representative period of time over which you could look at the, sort of the heterogeneity and clustering of vessels, so you would get a sense of what those intervals look like, and, what the difference between a period where vessels are being convoyed versus sort of
Yeah.
an even distribution. But certainly it's not.
That's too simplistic is what you're saying, or
Yeah,
not even realistic.
Well, and it's just, I mean, the density of trips is not sufficient, one in the morning, one in the evening.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, maybe we can talk again about
Yeah,
that.
and I would appreciate more input, definitely a little bit more discussion on that so that we can actually constrain it properly. But for the purposes of this evaluation, but I think it'd be fair to say that we've not truly reconciled ship action and mixing that happens due to it, right? So it's a more conservative analysis overall from that perspective.
Maybe, right? I mean, I think, isn't there some fundamental question, if you've got and this is where if you've got a plume of higher salinity water that is persisting for some period of days to a week in the middle part of the bay, but is being concentrated in the deep shift channel because it's so appreciably, for density reasons, so appreciably deeper than the rest of the bay, and then you have full depth mixing by vessels on some sort of periodicity. I mean, it stands to reason that you're dispersing that plume into the bay. Obviously, there's mixing, which we would assume is favorable, but may or may not be depending on the ambient conditions. I mean, you are just, you're moving that high density plume out of the ship channel, and what happens to it. I mean, I think we would need to model that to understand what the assumptions are about where it goes once displaced, right? Especially over time.
Yeah, so I think the concern you're bringing up is if we were to mix it, assuming we're, sometimes the draft goes as low as 8 meters, so that's pretty deep. So.
Say 8?
8 meters, like
No.
what, 25 feet or so?
Yeah,
like
no,
the-
we have
even-
vessels that have the full
even deeper
we
than
have
that,
vessels
right?
that are
So-
within 2 feet of the bottom of a 54-foot channel on
Right.
a regular basis,
Yeah.
especially mid-bay. So, again, I mean, the question is whether if there's a plume of high salinity water at the bottom of the channel, whether it's being mixed or it's being displaced, and what the dynamics look like there, right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. To me, a good example of that is sort of like your NBPS withdrawal right next to the brine, right? That's like the discharge is coming here, and then the NBPS is like, quarter mile further in, withdrawing it, maybe a little bit higher, but not that it's not a surface withdrawal, like it's roughly mid-depth, right? So it's already kind of like simulating more or less what you're saying in terms of like, and then it's actually taking that water and putting it out into Nueces Bay. That's probably a good test of what that effect is going to be. Now, if you were to mix that up and further, then you're actually, from a very more physics perspective, right? You're destroying that. You're likely not destroying. You're disturbing that pycnocline, which is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. Then you're likely to have more DO and other mixing of in atmospheric DO down into the water column, so that would potentially be beneficial, not harmful, right? Then the question becomes like, now overall in the water column you have higher salt concentration. If it goes out into the shallows, are you increasing the risk of stratification in the shallows? Now that we have not answered. That's a fair question, and just based on the magnitude of impacts you're seeing with the Nueces Bay, when you're pretty much releasing that saltier water in there, you're not seeing a big signal. The Nueces Bay impacts are still less than 0.5 ppt, so I would assume that would be the extent of the impacts, even if we were to disperse the plume. The more important thing is once you mix it with a broader body of water, now you're diluting it even more too, right, overall. So just from first principles and mass balance, like you would think like that impact would be relatively minor.
I think, and this where, I mean, there's a relatively long residence time in the broader bay,
Yeah.
in the shallow parts of the bay. And so then this is where, to Carrie's point, not here, the question of whether consideration of that mass balance effect, that accumulation on much more protracted intervals than we've looked at, right? So I think those are the questions that occur to me, but there are others here who are more qualified to raise that, I think. It varies, but we could use 550 is a good number of feet. But I can, it depends where you're asking specifically.
I'm just wondering if that ship mixing is. Yeah, sorry about that. You would think I'd learn after 8 meetings, but.
It's also, Mike, just the the answer to that depends. In some places, there are barred shelves, so there's a reduced depth that extends outside the edge of the channel. So not trying to hedge here, but, the actual, depends whether we're only concerned with the deepest profile and its depth shape.
I'm just wondering if that ship mixing is just gonna be limited to in the immediate, aftermath of the ship itself, or it's gonna extend across channel as well.
So, anecdotally, we know from folks who used to stand on the edge of the channel in Port A and wait till water was sucked off the flats to go down and grab flounder. So, we know that there's a pretty serious, there's a run up in the displacement effect, depending on what the profile looks like adjacent to whatever reach of the channel. In the inner harbor, it's edge to edge because there's not an extended flat area, right?
I have a question. I've been looking at these increases in salinity stratification. Here you have salinity, increases in salinity stratification illustrated as the pink shaded area, and then you have the density stratification. I keep going back to this because I find it very confusing. When we're looking at the water column stratification, we focus on density. What you are calling
It's both.
salinity stratification, it's driven by salinity and temperature.
Correct.
This is physical oceanography 101, right?
Yeah.
You can have gradients of salinity, which I think is what you're referring to, a salinity stratification. What is the difference between salinity stratification or density stratification?
The density is, like you said, a function of temperature and salinity, right? So we're showing both. The pink line is the gradient if you were to take salinity as a proxy for stratification and then take the delta in the.
So just the difference between the salinity on the top and the bottom?
Yes, between the base case and the with decel, right? So that's the pink line. The green line is the same, but calculated as density, right? You can also calculate the density based on the model predicted temperature and salinity. And then you can take the bottom density and the surface density. Then you can calculate a delta rho, right? The delta rho for the model without decel, delta rho for the model with decel, and that's what that green line is.
Okay, so when we are thinking about stratification in terms of the potential for hypoxia and anoxia, we're thinking of density-based stratification.
Correct, yes.
Right?
They're,
But the graphs are all, or most of them, going back to last week and this week, they are salinity stratification.
No, the middle panel shows the density, the top panel shows the salinity, the bottom panel shows both.
So the density stratification is the second panel.
Correct. Yes.
So as a reference, a density difference or a stratification of 1 is considered a stratified water column.
That's pretty strong stratification, right? So, and you'd see that here,
because we
right?
keep focusing on the pink, and
because the pink is
but
easier
we
to
really need to be looking at the difference in density and how those persist over time because strongly stratified waters are conducive to hypoxia.
Yeah, but I'll just note that, salinity is going to drive 80% of your density here, right?
But it's not going to determine the density structure of the water column on itself.
Right.
We look, that's why physical oceanographers look at
I
density.
understand. That's why we're showing both, right? No, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying it's from sort of like an effect perspective, they are both pointing in the same direction, right? You're not going to conclude something different by looking at the salinity difference versus the density difference.
No, but the magnitude matters.
The magnitude matters, without a doubt. And these numbers are the scale applies to both. So when you're seeing, you can see that salinity is about 0.5 to 0.6, but the density is actually more like 0.1 to 0.2, right? So to your point, when that green line starts to go about 1, that would be strong stratification, but that's also when you probably see salinity going up to 4 or 5, right?
No, what I understand is that the density difference, that second panel, that's the one that's telling me what the density difference is between the bottom and the surface, and that is indicative of how stratified the water column is.
Yeah, so there are 2 things that we want to make sure that we're all not mixing up on. we're not making an argument on whether the water column is stratified or not. We're trying to determine whether we are changing the stratification substantively enough. Like if your stratification is 1, are you making that 2? Right?
Yes, I understand.
So-
From the point of view of seeing what the effect of desalination is, yes. But we're looking at both things because the system, and you have shown this over and over, and this is very interesting, and it concurs with previous studies, that this is a system that naturally also has stratification.
Yes, without a doubt. Yeah. I mean, I'm not, that is pretty obvious when, in the vertical profiles that we saw earlier too, right? Like,
Can I just ask if, from a layman's perspective, if I understand correctly, if the naturally occurring stratification is subcritical, subthreshold, and even if the incremental change in stratification in and of itself is also subcritical, subthreshold, but together, but it pushes that stratification into a realm that becomes ecologically significant, then we can't just say because the change in stratification is itself, in an absolute sense, insignificant, it doesn't mean it's ecologically insignificant because it is pushing that naturally occurring stratification into a realm where it has impact, right? Is that the main point?
Absolutely, that's why we're looking at both things, and that is why it would have been really ideal, and I understand the challenges are not minor, of having dissolved oxygen in the model. Because you can go over a threshold. There have been occurrences here of documented with oxygen measurements that there is stratification. And the thing is that going to push it over some limit that is going to cause a problem? That's not an easy question to answer.
yeah, I mean, the best we can say here is like, does it exacerbate the stratification or not, right? And then if it exacerbates it to an extent that is large enough, then you could have an effect on DO. But we cannot conclude DO itself. We clearly didn't model DO. So, yeah, sorry. To your point, Dr. Herska, all of these show a stratified water column, right? Periodically it stratifies and then it breaks up. So there is never a question of whether the inner harbor or even the ship channel for that matter stratifies or not. It does stratify. So.
Is there anywhere in the world that has a 60-foot deep body of water that is not stratified? I mean, being a scuba diver, you hit it
Well,
at
I am
some
a
point,
student
yeah.
of estuaries, I'll answer. It will depend. Those that are cold water that have a lot of mixing probably have less stratification. Estuaries are naturally stratified. That doesn't mean it's not a problem here or elsewhere.
No, I mean, I'm not talking about estuaries, I'm talking about in 60 feet of water. I mean,
There are
you get a certain amount of-
estuaries that are 60 feet deep.
Okay, all right. Okay.
So we have 2 more questions with Brad and then Lamont.
I just want to come back. I know you haven't had a lot of time, but I don't see a lot of the third leg of research, and that's the verification. Closed form solutions. I asked about calculating the mixture flow just to validate the model. The other thing, when we're coming back to Carrie's point, are there areas that get low circulation? And when you look at those, you start, do I understand how the flow is actually occurring, in the bay under these conditions? So just want to highlight that coming back and getting some of those plots. So what is the flow going, the flow pattern? It validates the model, it gives confidence, and it also answers the question, I think, about are we depleting the zone that's closest to the land? Are we changing the nature of that? So I think those velocity profiles will do, answer some good questions, maybe even as regards the effect of the ships.
Yeah, I mean, we can definitely include some velocity profiles in our report.
And then
also
along with that,
maps of velocities. I mean, the best way to present that in estuarine models would be what we call as residual circulation of the flows, right? When you take the effect of the tides, like what is the residual circulation is what determines the long-term persistence of some phenomena.
Yeah.
Water quality or salinity or whatever it is. It's not easy to back out. I'll tell you that. It's a pretty complicated series of calculations to essentially filter the tides out and then, calculate the net sort of transport directions. And to me, like, those are fundamentally a function of flows rather than, tides, rather than stratification itself. Stratification to some extent has that, like we could do that, but probably the chances are that it's not really going to conclude that you affected the residual circulation in a substantial manner, right? Now, winds and other questions are highly relevant to residual circulation, right? Because if the wind direction completely shifts because of whatever global phenomena, then you might see some different patterns.
Just seeing the velocity profile coming out of the exit into Nueces Bay is just a point of validation, simple validation first. The flow is going in there.
Yeah,
And so seeing those circulation patterns from a gross scale, I think, it's part of validating, showing people that we've got this right.
Yep, we can definitely include some profiles or velocity vector maps that probably will tell you like which way the flows are going. Okay, so go ahead.
Let me try to simplify this for me. As the ship traffic go in and out of the channel, and picking up on Carrie's thought, as if I have a plume inside of the channel, whether or not that mixing pushes that plume into the bay or over on North Beach, how long, this model can't tell me, how long would it take for that plume to dissipate?
Good question. It's coming up in the next slide.
Okay, thank you. Next slide.
Excellent setup for my next series of slides. Thank you. All right, so that's all the model results. Now, getting specifically to this question of like, the persistence of the plume and for how long do you see that effect of stratification persist, right? So we are looking at it in a couple of different ways. In the color scales are challenging here, it's because the effect is very localized and limited to the channel. And I have a zoomed in version of this in the next slide, but let me explain what this is showing first. So this figure here shows the time average stratification difference with and without decel, right? First, we're looking at this in terms of salinity to Dr. Herska's point. We could also look at it from a density perspective as well. But all of these figures are just from the salinity perspective. The color bar here, I'm not showing negative values. It could also be negative. If you remember in the bottom panel, a lot of times it's, it's going below zero. Sometimes it goes above zero. What's relevant to us is periods where it's above zero, right? This sort of sums the cumulative effect over the course of a year, right? Or like it's a time average effect. Like, are you seeing particular pockets that are persistently positive versus pockets that are, not positive. The blue means that it's relative, the effect is, there is not a substantive long-term effect. Any colors, hues of purple or yellow would tend to indicate that there is a persistent effect over a long period of time, right? On average, you're having a positive effect. So that's the left panel. The right panel has the time component of it, right? So this is the proportion of time when you're seeing a certain magnitude of an effect. For the purposes of this, we took 1 ppt as a cutoff. But in the next figure, a couple of slides down, I have box plots that shows the sensitivity to what if that's 0.5, what if that's 2. And again, the next figure you're going to see there'll be more apparent. Like most of this is, when it's completely zero, it's transparent. That's why you're not seeing anything here. So really where the color starts to show up is in the channel, and more so in the inner harbor here. And we'll see that in a better way in the next one. But this full extent is helpful because this addresses some of the several questions that came up before, right? What is sort of spatially, like where are you seeing that effect? What is the duration of that effect? The duration of that effect outside of the inner harbor and the channel is very minimal. If it was there, you would have seen that, like, goes back to your contours. This is where the contours would have looked, basically been on top of each other, right? If they were different, you would have seen an effect here. In all of these areas, you would have seen an effect. Oh, yeah, sorry. Oh, too much.
Oh, the scale here is percent of simulation.
Yeah, percent, so that's 2 years of simulation, so that's roughly, 700 plus days.
I'm not good with colors again, but so what we're saying there up at the darkest area there, am I reading that right, around Nueces Bay and the causeway up there, between that and Corpus?
So the darkest star is in the inner harbor. I'll actually show a zoomed in version in the next slide. That'll make it a little bit easier to read this. So this is the same set of figures, except now it's shown top and bottom. Top is showing the salinity difference, right? And the bottom is showing the percentile.
So the area around the causeway that's dark, right?
So in Nueces, this is all just the turbidity and the aerial imagery. It's not an effect. I tried to find a color scheme that would actually work. It was very challenging to show both an aerial imagery and the color. But effectively, this is all pretty much everywhere outside the inner harbor and the channel, it's all 0. Right, like percent of time is like very, very small.
That dark color that you're referring to is actually the difference in the Google imagery, basically. It's just like different shades of the color. It's not coming from the difference.
So
it's just a background noise, basically.
The scale, though, is referencing of the colors.
Yeah, it's just a coincidence that the colors are the same, basically. It's but that's not the...
The percent of simulation time that you have a high stratification difference looks to me like up at the upper end, that matches the color around the causeway. It's dark.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think he's talking about this area, right? Right here.
Right there.
Yeah, so I will present the same information as just a contour map, so there is no color conflicts, but that would clear that up. Like essentially, this is just an artifact of the aerial imagery, and
okay, I don't know what this means.
I heard you saying that shades of green don't matter on the bottom graph picture.
Correct.
Shades of green are immaterial.
Yes, so these shades of green are all, that's just the actual aerial imagery showing the water color.
Okay.
And yeah,
Okay.
so, yeah. And you can see that in the top panel here, right? So the top panel, the contrast is more clear. Like here, you're seeing the time average stratification difference outside of the inner harbor is pretty much 0 everywhere else, right? It's all very close to that blue, right? So, okay, so this actually is probably much easier to interpret. It's bringing that same information in sort of an aerial. This goes to the habitat pieces that you're talking about, right? Or what proportion of area are we seeing a change? Within the inner harbor, right, depending on what threshold you pick, if you pick half a PPT as your sort of the significant enough stratification threshold, your change is anywhere between, depending on, so this is essentially 730 data points is what goes into this box plot, right? Because it's daily. What proportion of area exceeds that threshold is what we're showing here, right? So for example, on this particular, let's say let's pick an outlier here. This one particular day, over 70% of the inner harbor would have had a salinity gradient of 0.5 ppt or higher. It would have been exacerbated by 0.5 ppt or higher. Right, that's what that is showing. Now, if you, and that is not surprising. That's where you saw most of the impacts due to the desal discharge. That's where you saw the bottom to surface salinity go, show significant changes. And so we're showing this as a percent of region area. What that means is that you take the total surface area of the inner harbor and you normalize it by that, right? So that gives a common denominator for each location. So the same thing for, what if you increase that threshold to 1 ppt? It drops dramatically, right? So you essentially, by the way, for those of you who are not familiar with box plots, a box plot shows the 25th percentile, the median, the 75th percentile, and then the outliers beyond the whiskers, right? And so the whiskers, I think, go to 95th, two sigmas? Yeah, something like that. The fact that, even your 75th percentile is less than much less than 5, let's say, I don't, maybe about 1, 1% of the area. So what it's telling us is that very high impact is very localized, or it doesn't affect us. It's not very extensive spatially, even within the inner harbor, right? And impacts of 2 ppd or higher, you don't really see it like you do occasionally see that go. Very rarely you see that go about, but most of the time you're not seeing impacts of this magnitude. Now, how does this look when you come to Corpus Christi Bay? Now, keep in mind, Corpus Christi Bay has the ship channel where you are seeing the impacts, and then the bay proper, right? So the surface area is much larger here. The answer is it's the only reason you're seeing a blip here is because those are the impacts within the ship channel, right? And outside of the ship channel, there's really not much of an impact at all. And within USS Bay, same thing. Like, they're practically like actually zero. I think like maybe there are a few isolated points you might see with 0.5 ppd or higher, but for all practical purposes, it's you're not seeing a significant enough effect within USS Bay. So this kind of gets at that aerial impact, right? So the previous slide at different magnitudes, and the previous slide also showed you sort of the duration, proportion of time. So you kind of get a sense for both the space and temporal magnitude of that impact between the two. So that was for the base case. So this is going back to the question you asked earlier, sir, about like, are you going to show it for hypothetical worst case? What happens if, when we have climate change and sea level rise and all of that, higher ocean temperatures and so on. So again, I'm only showing the zoomed in version because this is where the action is. You can see like within the inner harbor a similar sort of effect, and then outside of the inner harbor, almost no impacts.
I had a question. So mostly we've been focusing on stratification, which is localized to where the outfall's at, right? So as the plume kind of spreads out, you're getting less stratification. But we haven't really talked about, like, are there any minor salinity increases kind of nearby? We haven't really seen many, like, I guess, spatial plots.
Well, this is your spatial plot right there.
Right, but it's focused on stratification, difference between top and bottom. But I'm just kind of curious, overall, a salinity increase from top to bottom outside in the near area. Does that make sense?
So you're asking a map, something similar to, with and without the decel? Or?
The difference in just bulk salinity concentrations.
Oh, just diff of cell. Okay, yeah, we can definitely create that.
Cool.
Yeah, that's easy to do.
Because I don't expect there to be a lot of stratification far off, but there could be some, just general salinity increases.
So general overall, like, the trend of like, do we see an increase in salinity, right?
Yeah.
That's what you're getting at, yeah.
I just wanted to mention something about the worst case scenario. I'm really glad that you were able to do runs with the freshwater inflow and looking at a pulse of freshwater, which is kind of how freshwater gets into the system here, and looking at specific periods of winds. You're absolutely right. We went for the kind of scenarios of conditions, and 2 years of no wind would make no sense. But in rolling in all the other variables into the worst case scenario, we can't really see what each factor does, right? So we can't see like the warming. What does the warming do? What does the sea level rise do? And I just want to make it clear that it obscures, they can act in different directions in terms of the effect. So having the worst case scenario is very, very unlikely, and then we were not able to see what happened with specific conditions in the system.
Yeah, so in terms of the hypothetical worst case, your biggest stress to the system really is your sea level rise and ocean temperatures, right? Even in our base case, the freshwater inflows are really not that significant, right? Like, there's probably a spring period in 2023 and then in spring period in 2024 when you have any decent amount of freshwater coming in, but it's practically zero for a good chunk of it. So you've already looked at the effect of no freshwater by itself there, right? Then the other maybe potential effect is the second desal discharge with CC polymers in Is that like how much of that by itself is what is the question you're getting at? But I want to say, like, again, the tool is available. Those analyses can be done in future, right? And so the tool has been built, and it's just in the time frame that we had, those analyses could not be completed. And so we combined all of these together to address the more
I totally understand the rationale, thank you.
So this does not, this worst case does not include the transfer of water by the power plant?
It does.
So what this is showing is that there's minimal to no effect on Nueces Bay.
Correct, yeah.
In
Or
terms of
Corpus Christi
stratification.
Bay.
In the stratification, yes,
In the
in terms of
stratification.
stratification. So it doesn't change, it doesn't have an appreciable effect on the stratification within Nueces Bay.
All right, do you have something similar to this for what the level of salinity is?
Well, we saw that in the earlier figures, when we were showing the actual salinity predictions against data, but I've not created a map, but we can certainly include that.
I think it would be well to have a map that shows.
Yeah, we can create a similar map on, what the salinity.
Because I think the permit study showed that there would be like a 0.38 part per thousand increase at the discharge of the power plant into Nueces Bay.
Yeah, we can definitely create the salinity map itself. Yeah. So, to your point, like, the tool is available. It can be used for all of those applications. And also, I want to mention that, this is a pretty well, in our view anyway, you all may not agree with this yet. But when you look at it, hopefully you'll come to that same conclusion. It's the model explains the observations quite well. You have the hydrodynamic engine to drive anything else that you want to drive in future, right? You could use this model to build a water quality module on top of it. You could expand prop wash effects and other, so the basic hydrodynamic engine is up and running. This is the hard part. Well, water quality is a whole beast of its own. I don't want to say that it's nowhere near easy depending on how much information you have, but none of that would be possible without this. This is your first step in doing all of that, right? So this fun basic tool is available now, and any variations of it in the future would be relatively easy to.
I'm still puzzled and troubled that we didn't get, that we have a single sensor that's kind of questionable. Sharon, maybe there's even older historical data showing where Nueces Bay went over 50, because I heard it from my work here 12 years ago that it did, and it would have been really interesting to see this model under continued low inflows get to that 50 and see whether there was a duration impact by Inner Harbor. I understand we don't have that right now, but I think so one thing I would ask is that could you continue to run this model longer in time? We were just barely seeing, I think that sensor came up at the end of 2025, was continuing to show high and dropped in early 2026. But what's interesting to me is that we hear of this, we see that sensor, it's a questionable, we don't have more, but would extended time at these low flow conditions show that up? And it might be interesting data to have for, just understanding. It seems like every 10 years we get into this kind of scenario, and understanding that duration would be valuable.
So I just want to mention something. Generally speaking, from the sensor point of view, the way that it measures salinity, no sensor measures salinity. It's normally specific conductivity and temperature, and use a formula to convert that. It is widely accepted that that range that is acceptable for using that formula is from 2 to 42. If you go from above 42, that formula is no longer valid, basically, right? So unless you actually go there and then take a sample and then kind of like do it like old school way, like measuring the salinity and all of that, I would suspect to that sensor value above 42. I'm not saying that is wrong. I'm not suggesting that, but I'm saying that it's not going to pass the QAQC.
That's incorrect. Those sensors go up to 70. We work
I'm not
with
saying
them.
that they're not going, but they're not valid, they're not.
They are
past
valid. We
KQC.
work with them extensively.
Yeah, I
That's,
agree.
42
These
is
are
not
made for
correct.
estuaries in these conditions. This is not your oceanographic seabird sensor.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the tool is available. It can be used and extended in future if someone wants to do that, certainly.
There is a study by Margaret Forbes and Ken Dunton, published in 2006 in Estuaries and Coast, that has a series of salinities that we could look at. We need to make sure that they're not tidal creeks, that they are actually in the bay, but they were reporting high salinities. It's a shallow system with sometimes no freshwater inflow. It makes sense that sometimes it is hypersaline.
Yeah.
Like the Laguna Madre, it's hypersaline.
Yeah, to me, like, I would just go back to the same question we're posing to the model, right? Like, if you want to capture very fine scale, very localized salinity increases, this model at this resolution may not be the tool to do that, right? However, if you're trying to understand broad shifts in patterns on like which way would we expect that to go, this is appropriate for that question. If you want to get into the, the tidal channels and, specifically like in the delta, like, you have a channel that wets and dries, extends out, those require very fine resolution to really get the hydrodynamics right in that resolution. And we'd have like, we don't have the data to build a model at that resolution. And the question you're asking too is like, there is an intellectual curiosity of why that is happening, and there's a broader concern about, is that going to affect biota or other uses in the bay, right? And that's a legitimate question. And if that question is of interest, then the type of analysis you'll do is different versus, the way we are applying the model here.
But in the interest of time right now, if we saw velocity profiles, salinity profiles aerially, spatially, what Jason was just asking, are there areas that we don't get a lot of circulation that salinity goes higher and that would induce, what we all care about is, I think we're trying to get at, are we going to kill fish here? And if normally we would because of natural conditions, then the question is, are we extending that? And I think it would be interesting to, if you can, go home and start running this so we get yet another year of data and see if you see something different.
Yeah. Thinks we had half hour? Yeah, so.
Yeah, time check, we have 30 minutes. I think for the agenda, we have conclusions and more discussion time. I don't know, Pradeep, if you have more slides.
Yeah, so maybe we could just do a wrap here with a summary. So this is again showing the box plots of what you saw in the previous one. On the left side, you already saw this, right, under existing condition, what does it look like? Actually, in your hypothetical worst case, that inner harbor effect is even smaller. And yes, and that was my reaction to first when I saw that. And then I thought about it a little bit more. What's actually happening is your sea level rise is actually diluting your bloom. Because now you have ocean water that is less salty than your brine, and that is actually helping things, not making it worse, right? So that's what is happening there. It's a little counterintuitive. First, when I saw that, I was like, what? Like, this is, like, we threw the kitchen sink at it, and why is it like this? And then, then of course it made a little
What event are you speaking of there? I mean, when you say that, because in general, we've got lower salinity waters closer in that the fish are coming into, and we've got a higher salinity out in the Gulf.
So the hypothetical worst case has 12 centimeters higher water, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're providing essentially more seawater to come in to the inner harbor now than under current conditions.
Right.
We have a more concentrated condition within the inner harbor that is actually getting diluted by the seawater because of sea level rise, rather than exacerbating the effect, is actually mitigating.
Right, that's the inner harbor condition.
Yeah. Anyway, so just to wrap, so this is just the sensitivity between the 10 and 20 layer model. I just prepared this also for the 20 layer to see if our conclusions are going to be different. One key thing to note here is that you are, the box does move a little bit higher, and we flagged this even when we were looking at earlier, right? That stratification is a little bit more exacerbated between the bottom and the surface because of your higher resolution. But it fundamentally doesn't change anything other than that, right? So when you switch to a 1 PPT, the direction is the same. And then outside of the inner harbor, the effects are very similar and not really appreciably different with a more resolved model. So, okay, so that's the last slide. We've completed the modeling. We've applied different thresholds of stratification. We've got some very good input from y'all on different things. We've tried as many of those things as we could, within the time we had. In general, what we're seeing is that, the desal would increase stratification overall, and it would increase, stratification within the inner harbor the most, right? And then up to 2 PPT perhaps. And that's not all the time. That's like, as you saw in the previous slide, like it's very rare that you get up there. And then the changes to the stratification events, and you saw these signals in the various figures that we showed, they dissipate with tides. They could persist for a period of days to weeks perhaps, but they do dissipate. Seldom do you see it extending more than a month. The outside of the inner harbor and the Corpus Christi channel, those changes are actually, I'm saying generally less than 0.5 PPT, but as you saw in those figures, it's mostly less than 0.1 PPT, right? That stratification difference. The last point, and this was a concern raised, we did not model DO in this study. However, based on this, if there is a risk of any DO effects, it would primarily be, you would expect it to see it in the inner harbor and the channel more than outside of that, right? So just based on the increase in the impact to the stratification changes. But that's, that is just an opinion, it's not been, we didn't model DO, so. I think that those are the main takeaways, and yeah, we have the city council meeting on the 2nd. We'll document all of this work in a report, and yeah.
You said you had a slide for me on the boundary conditions?
Yes, we can get to, absolutely. I even have one for the mass balance question you asked. I just don't have exactly what you wanted. Okay, so.
I just want to mention something. I found that the Salt 1 station is using the MS5 multi-parameter water quality data sound to measure salinity, although it measures from 0 to 70. Anything above 50 is not accurate on that sound. So just want to mention that.
Okay, so the ocean boundary condition, right? So and then, you all pointed out to this data source, which we could have used. We didn't have it at the time when we built the model, but eventually we found it. The key thing to note here is we were originally using Baycast model, which is this teal line. And then now we're using high mod, which is this red line. The Baycast model, of course, the reason we started with the Baycast model was because it was built specifically for the coast. We thought it'd be more accurate. And it turned out that it was, wherever we did have data at other locations, it was underestimating the salinity considerably. And this kind of tells you that. And I want to just point out to this period, right? Our simulation period is 23 and 24, not the years prior, right? So in 23 and 24, this is the Baycast, this is the high mod, and actually the data splits the difference. It's right in between.
Well, it's HICOM, right? Because high mod is another type of model. HICOM.
Yes, HICOM. Thank you. I've been losing a lot of sleep over this project, so so essentially what this is telling us, our rationale for switching is still pretty valid. Now we could go back and run it with this black dots where we have the data, but then we have to still come up with salinity at the ocean boundary for the periods where we don't have data, right? So we would have taken a very similar approach. We would have tried to pair the high mod or not the high com to the observations, and then we would have scaled it down. That's the way we would have developed that boundary condition. So to me, like, these are all very defensible ways of developing boundary conditions for models. It's not, we're not doing anything that is unusual. This is typically like where you would not have data at that resolution all the time, right? So you have to use all the different sources, patch up the gaps. And our approach for patching up the gap was to use ground truth baycast where we can, right? And then extend it, right?
So, Pradip, I just want to mention 2 points, Brad. One is the idea of offsetting the data at the boundary condition from the baycast was based on the data simulation. So they looked at the nearest data available and did that adjustment, not because the results were not in agreement with the observation, so you make the changes to the boundary condition. It was actually the opposite. We look at the baycast and look at the nearest gauge that was available, and based on the difference, we actually made that offsetting to the data. So it was that technique called data simulation, basically. So you have a model, and then you look at the observation, and you bring it to that. The second thing that I want to mention is like here and there, we can find some patch of data that is worth 3 months, 4 months, that we can definitely bring to the model, but that's not a systematic approach, basically. We want to have something that if someone from now want to take this model and then run with it for 26 to 2030, in 2030, basically, or like want to run it from 2015 to 2018, doesn't have to go and switch with multiple, like 10 different sorts of data. So we want to make sure that we have like a systematic approach that this model is really reusable in the future.
Right, I guess the thing we want to be careful of here is that we're not model focused in terms of not representing the 3 legs of research here. And so when we just keep turning knobs to get what we want, I guess as I read up on this baycast, it was developed for our situation, and maybe you know better, Sharon, but this HICOM sounded to me like much deeper ocean kind of work. But even coming up into the 3 miles close in, we're in shallow bay area. So the rationale, other than, geez, we'd like this thing to agree, and this will make it agree, I'm looking for a physics, marine biology reason to cast out using what's developed for these shallow areas, baycast, and say, well, this works better to get what we want, doesn't kind of give me the marine biology, physics to say why we should do that.
You're absolutely right about that. But what I want to emphasize is there is a hierarchy in the model right now. So it gets from NOAA, the pure observation. If it's not available, go to baycast. If it's not available, go to HICOM. It's not like that we are switching. So there is a hierarchy in the model right now.
Yeah.
So you're saying,
we switched it to
yeah. So like for the entire period of the run, the duration, wherever the NOAA data is available, that's the priority. It's going to use that. If that's not available, it's going to use baycast. If baycast is not available, then switch to HICOM.
So just looking at this chart, you've got a lot of times when the salinity is down below 20 or 25, but that doesn't seem realistic given that, tell me what's driving that to get it down below 25 on all of those cases when we have no inflows, no rain events to drive that down. It seems to me like the HICOM model is more representative.
I think that, let me chime in here. The data from the TABS buoy, so that TABS buoy, those are actual observational data points from a NOAA buoy that is offshore. So that's not representative of what's happening in the estuary. That's for your boundary conditions.
This is boundary condition outside,
offshore,
exactly.
so on the shelf, basically, right? Part of that, of the model domain. And those values are low periodically because sometimes we have water from the Mississippi that gets to this part of the coast and dilutes the water. HICOM, I'm guessing you're taking it, it doesn't have that. So that's why the salinities are higher and typical of the more offshore waters of the Gulf.
You're absolutely right. The baycast model has all the way to Louisiana and Mississippi freshwater inflow in it. HICOM has 0 freshwater inflow.
Yeah, but from a localized condition, we didn't have any freshwater inflows in 2024.
This is outside of the bay. This is like in the Gulf of Mexico,
Okay,
and
so that's taken into account like flows from the Mississippi River.
correct. Yes.
And all the other rivers that
Yes.
flow in.
But that water is the one that is coming to the system through tidal.
Yeah,
freezing.
all
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, and, from the modeling perspective, right, so you're driving it with HICOM where we have it, and then we're switching it over to Baycast when we don't have it.
No,
We
Baycast
can,
first, then.
no, we actually switched that.
Okay.
Yeah, so because for these 2 years, Baycast is actually, and you can see that here, right? For 23 and 24, it is underrepresenting the observation substantially. So there is a good rationale for, why we are switching these, right? So it's not grounded in, it's not ad hoc, it's not to validate the salinity in the bay. You try to get the best boundary conditions that you can, and then you see what you do, right? And that's the thing about the hydrodynamic model too. Like there's not a whole lot to tune, unlike a water quality model where you have many degrees of freedom. In a hydrodynamic model, your degrees of freedom are very limited, which is why I like the physics part of it very much. Because you get your boundary conditions bathymetry right, your model should generally do well. So
Yeah, I can't say I'm 100% comfortable because we had a 15, the first week you presented, you said 1 to 2, but when you looked at the numbers, there was 15 part per thousand difference in some. And then we resolved that the next week by making this change.
not this change. I want to correct that because for the record, the change that I'm talking about was due to an incorrect freshwater boundary condition within Nueces Bay. Not this.
Not this.
So I just want to make sure.
You said it was the combination, I recall.
Right. I mean, this was also changed, so I wanted to present this as well. I didn't want to say we didn't change. There were 3 factors I said, that changed that could have affected salinity. And by far the biggest one is the Nueces River freshwater flow. We were using the Mathis flows, which turned out to be way higher than what was actually coming into the bay, in Nueces Bay. So it was essentially giving this big freshwater pulse, lowering the salinity within Nueces Bay artificially. And there was no evidence for that at all in the data or the actual flow data. And the only reason we were using the Mathis gauge was because that's how the port model earlier was built. So we just carried that through, and then we took a harder look at it to say, is that boundary condition even appropriate? It's not. There's a better boundary condition to use. And so,
Okay, and I want to flip a little bit on you because you said earlier that the biggest influence was tidal.
No, the biggest influence, the tidal influence has to do with the breakup of stratification in the channel.
Oh, you were talking stratification.
Yes.
Okay. Not salinity. Okay.
I just wanted to real quickly say thank you for doing the 20-layer model. I really appreciate it. I know it's extra work. Y'all are already doing a lot. I had a quick question.
Get back my sleep.
Yeah. To follow up on the request I made on salinity increase maps in the Nueces and Bayfront area, would that be possible to have for the June 2nd presentation?
I mean, I have 1 business day, and then I
Okay.
will do my best. I will try.
Okay. And then last question. The city in 2020 did acoustic Doppler profiling stuff, velocity measurements in the channel. And I was wondering how different the model's velocities were compared to the city's measurements.
Yeah, we didn't simulate 2020 or that particular period specifically, right? So
Yeah, I was wondering if it was in the same magnitude.
yeah, I mean, the modeled velocities are anywhere between, within the inner harbor, they are less than half a meter per second typically. And then outside, and I'm just quoting a ballpark number, right? It does,
Cool.
It changes with the tides. And actually, a lot of times it's even lower than half a meters per second. And then sometimes it goes higher than that. If I remember correctly, that was generally in the ballpark of the numbers that was measured. It was a transect measurement at right where the discharge was coming. Correct.
Right. Yeah, they were trying to measure it right where the discharge would be,
Yeah.
and they had gotten 4 centimeters per second.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
that is actually about right because most of
Okay.
the time it is and that the measurements that was presented is average.
Right.
And
yeah.
there is a profile of velocity like we talked about, right? And so depending on where you are in the water column, that velocity is going to be different.
Right, because it's
So-
usually higher towards the top.
Also, for the record, you mentioned centimeter per second, not meter per second, right?
Correct, yeah.
So that's
huge
half a
difference.
meter is 50 centimeters. So it's like if it's below, it's still within the range that you're talking about.
I mean, like,
Because he's mentioning half a meter, not centimeter.
that's 50 centimeters.
Right, I don't want to say like 0.04 meters
No,
or
but
whatever.
it could very well be. Like
Yeah.
most of the, except when you have like strong tides coming in, that's when the velocity picks up. But we can also, in our report, we'll present that. you
Okay,
know.
cool. Thank you.
Like, and to your earlier request of like, can you show velocity maps? We can certainly show velocity maps. We'll show like, here is the range of velocities predicted within the inner harbor. We'll actually show at that particular transect with the recognition that, they're not the same year, but here's the range of velocities we're predicting. Here's what was measured.
Right,
And
because that's important for mixing, right?
Yeah,
So it
absolutely.
would be
100%.
relevant.
Yeah.
And until we get the report, you were saying it's 0.5 meters per second?
Don't quote me on that. I'm just picking a number that I see, but we scaled our arrows when we looked at some of the velocity figures to about 0.2 to 0.3 meters per second. And then you'll see sometimes that the arrows go higher than that.
Okay.
So that should be about, meters per second. Let's get our units right. Sometimes it goes to half a meter per second or so, or even higher, but a lot of times you can't even see the arrows. They're really tiny, right? Which is more consistent with the 4 centimeters per second that you
Yeah, because I had looked around at other measurements that have been taken in the channel, and for the most part, it seemed like the average was around 0.1 meters per second.
That sounds about
around
right.
that area.
I think that's about what the model, that's the scale that we were using actually to compare our arrows.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
I as well want to compliment you on the work you guys have done. I think you've answered a lot of questions. I think the only elephant for me kind of left in the room is longer duration. I think Carrie and others asked what happens over the course of 10, 20 years. And obviously we're going to have some cycles in there, but if and the unanswered question about these high salinity periods, if you could continue to give us some longer runs and give us more of the salinity at the bottom over a long period of time, if you can pull that from the data. I know you probably can't have that by June 2nd. You don't need to sleep. But yeah, that would be.
Well, even if I don't sleep, the computers can only churn so fast, so we would.
Yeah, but no, I think that's an unanswered question. What's the longer duration? If we had a 10-year run and showing that we didn't have a salinity buildup at the bottom, that would, I think, kind of put this thing together in entirety, so.
So I think one solution to that I don't know how much feasible is it, but I think maybe FEC can give us that response is we can look at the total mass of salinity available in the system and then have like a time series over the 2 years to see how much that changed. Because that kind of could give you kind of an idea of the accumulation is happening or like fluctuation is happening or what's the trend on that.
Yeah, I think if we looked at that one chart where we're looking at that period where you went out to 25, 2026, it wasn't the magnitude of what that particular buoy or sonobuoy was measuring, but there was kind of an uptrending. And that would indicate that if we went another year to that.
No, what I'm suggesting is like when you look at the with and without scenarios, you can look at the total, like the difference in the total mass of like salt in your system.
Yeah.
And see, because those salinity fluctuation could come from anything else, right? We don't know like what are the source of those fluctuation of high salinity. But if you look at the difference of the mass, that's purely coming from the desal unit, and then you can see if that mass is accumulating in the system or is actually getting out of the system.
Yeah, so if we could do that spatially as well, are there pockets where this happens and not just at one, bulk point?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for doing this. I would say there's going to be a long-term monitoring element of this, so any ideas you all have on where we should put new monitoring stations or anything like that, things that would have been helpful in doing this or you feel would increase the accuracy of future studies like this, I think that would be great. I was looking, on the Nueces Bay thing. That is body of water that goes hypersaline naturally, given our changes in environment. I know there's been a huge amount of work on how to solve that or fix that. That might be something for you all to think about how to adapt the model for. You know, I saw that Dr. Toe did a study for Water Development Board where they had 17 different project ideas for how to fix it or address it. And, you know, I kind of thinking about y'all's model, thought that might be something that you know, you could plug in each of those projects to this model and see what effect that might have. And I think that might be useful. And to that end, I've heard some interest, you know, apparently there's going to be some sort of effort on the state to engage on that issue, given all the talk on inflows and that sort of stuff. Are you all available to discuss your findings and kind of what you've seen with state or federal officials if they want?
Yeah, we're happy to.
Okay, great.
I mean, this is publicly funded work, so, you know,
Yeah.
it's available for everybody.
All right, thank you.
On the monitoring, that's an interesting question. You know, that's not specifically part of our work, but I think what would have really helped, one of the fundamental questions we're asking is the vertical extent of stratification, and what is completely missing are depth profiles of salinity, CTD casts, periodic CTD casts, or even just a buoy with multiple salinity and temperature sensors would go a long way in validating any future modeling work, or just understanding long-term monitoring of like how these, you know, if all these different projects come online, how do things change? That would be very helpful.
Would that be in the ship channel?
Well, primarily the ship channel is where our concern, but however, like if there are other locations where that is in like, you know, near the power plant discharge, how does things change? It wouldn't hurt to like have like a periodic CTD cast. The ship channel is where it would make the most sense, because that's where, you know, like the CTD cast, depth profiling, but that doesn't mean that you cannot, like shallow locations, you can certainly have like a bottom and a surface sensor, or if you can access it by a boat, you know.
Right, because it's tough with the ship channel because there's traffic. So would you recommend the TCEQ to do more frequent and more thorough
Well,
profiles?
or they can install a mooring that has, you know, essentially like on one of the piers, you can install like a pipe and then attach different sensors at depth, right? That would give you high frequency temperature and salinity data. It's, you know, a conductivity sensor and a temperature sensor, right? That's all you need for that.
Just a quick time check. We have 6 more minutes. I know there are a few more comments, but also we need to address with Nick, who will be able to have some speaking at the next meeting. So if you don't mind, we can have a few more comments and then pass it over to Nick.
Yeah, I wonder if we could get to that now, just because
Right.
I have a hard stop, and I apologize, but I've got another meeting at 2 I've got to get to. But I think we'd like to gain the committee's consensus on how to approach participation at June 2nd and what the thoughts are.
Anybody want to speak? Really, you know, I've said this a couple of times, and Peter, the city manager, but I wanted the committee to have a couple representatives to speak to the city council. We'll obviously hear from Pradeep, but I think it'd be good since you all have invested so much time. 8 times 3 hours at least, right? So quite a few hours spent, and this has been a very engaging committee. I think it would benefit the council if they hear directly from a few of you. And your opinions could be completely different than Pradeep's, and that's not a problem. I think that helps to validate the work that you all did. So we're just looking for a volunteer or two to speak to the council. I would say probably 2 to 3 to 4 minutes or so. If you need more time, though, just let us know, and we can accommodate that. And it would just be to share your reflections on the process, on the model, the results, what you feel personally or otherwise. So that's the thought. If there isn't a volunteer, that's okay. But I think, or volunteers, I should say, but I think it would be beneficial to the council to hear from folks other than city staff and the consultant.
I think it's important to include one of the academics that are in the room if they're available, because they have the actual knowledge to, you know, we're limited on time, and that was a big thing, this whole process, but Yeah.
We also want it to come from the committee. I mean, I can tell somebody to do it or ask them, but I think it'd be better if the committee as a group, which you all have worked well with each other, kind of endorse who you all think should go up in front of city council would be better as well.
I volunteer to serve as tribute. That's
Okay.
a quote from the movie, right?
What's that?
From the Hunger Games.
Okay, we have one, David Loeb so far.
I'll volunteer as well.
Okay, we got Jason Hill. Okay, and then Dr. Sharon, did you want to as well?
I'd like to talk to Mike and get back to you. 'Cause
Okay.
Mike had to leave early, and we can always coordinate with Jason and Brad.
Okay. So we're gonna put potentially Dr. Sharon, you're gonna coordinate with Mike. We got Brad, Jason, David, and Deanna, you want to as well? Okay, so let's try to be, since there's no problem being 5, I guess, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
We'll also have options of comment.
Absolutely, you do, right. So let's try about 3 minutes, if you can, see if 3 minutes is enough. If not, just let us know, just we'll generally know how much time. But that's great, I think that's a good representation. And I think it really just adds more credibility to the work that is very credible that you've all done. And as a city manager, I want to thank you, and I've said it before, for the great work that you've done here.
I just
Okay.
wanted to, since I had to talk about that, I just wanted to make one comment
Sure.
about, from a fisherman's point of view, because I think I'm probably the only fisherman here, and that's probably why, I think that's why I was put on this committee. I kind of get a feeling like, maybe I'm wrong, but the Inner Harbor, like, it has life in it. It has tarpon, it has snook. Yes, we cannot fish it because of Homeland Security and all of that. Some of the largest mangrove snapper I've ever caught in my life were off the rocks at the Lexington. So, I mean, we're literally at ground zero. The ship channel itself, all the way to the Aransas Pass and to the Aransas jetties, that is a fish highway, that is a shrimp highway. It's important to remember that, just because we might not see something out in the very shallows. It's a very important thing to remember that without a highway, think of it as rural America, right? Without a highway, you have no town, and you have no little towns. So the stratification and things that we're seeing in that ship channel, and I think it needs more time to be interpreted, ecologically, but we need to keep in mind that that is a very important part of the bay system in general and overall, all the way through Nueces, even into the upper Laguna Madre. Packery Channel helped flush a little bit. It still has some struggles, but fishing in this area my entire life, I know that the ship channel plays a very, very vital role in the fish highway. So that's all I had to say.
I am disappointed at the time left for at least you and Mike. I mean, I've always seen this two parts. There's computational, and then there's the interpretation of what that does to our fishery. And I don't think I'm good enough to do that. I've got some historical data, but I do think we really need to rely on the experts, and it would have been great for them to have a couple of weeks to peruse this against studies and so forth. And we're not getting that here, and by June 2nd, what are we gonna have? I don't know if you guys are willing to work through the weekends and provide that, but I think we're shortchanging the importance of that part of taking the results. What does it mean?
I couldn't agree more, and this is something Mike and I have discussed, that because of the short time frame for the overall modeling effort, we really pushed. I mean, we really saw results last week and this week, right? This is where the heart of it, of the results have been, and there's been a huge effort to get this done. But there's not a lot of time for us to process these results, so up until today, what we were seeing was considered preliminary. All your slides for last week were preliminary. You were working on the model. So I don't know. I mean, I don't fully understand how much we can, or expected, I guess, to be able to say within 5 days of receiving a lot of results.
Yeah, let me just remind us, Doctor, that the goal, we could have just hired the consultant and had him report to council on June 2nd, but we wanted to kind of an iterative process and an engagement of at least a representative group. But nowhere in that conversation did we say, we want this group to take it out to even more groups, just to be fair to the process. So the process that we laid out never had that setup that you just talked about. But we do agree it could have benefit. But I think what this results show is what we've seen many times before in the 6 or so studies in different locations. What this study does is something I asked for, which is a more comprehensive look at the bodies of water. And so we have that. But there's been a lot of data out there for years that can be peer reviewed. So we're working within the confines of the council wanting to, and Texas Water Development Board and the state wanting us to make a decision on the Inner Harbor desalination, so.
I'd just like to say that like a lot of people are interested in the ecological impacts, and I think the thing that makes most sense would be to get the data that is generated from this to the academic experts so that they can take their time to go through it and not feel rushed and to give an assessment, since this is something that people are very interested in.
I agree that. I agree that is the crowning, I guess, thing in Corpus Christi is the bay. The people want to know whether or not the bay will be destroyed or not. Yes, you did were tasked with having a study done, but is this just a checkbox saying that we did the study and not having the implementation of that study, or how it's going to be affected, how it's going to affect our crowning jewel, which is the bay? Yes, we did a study and we checked the box. We did the study, but the data that came out of that study, how will it impact the bay from here until 2030? What are the impacts on the fisheries, on the estuaries of this particular plumes that could develop in that bay? Yes, you did a study. You had a model. You put stuff in the model to see whether or not it is a model. But now, how do we interpret that model to see whether or not it is going to be impactful to that particular bay? That's all I got to say.
And I agree with Lamont. I appreciate everybody getting together and being on this committee, but now that we're toward the end, I still think we haven't even answered that question. What is the environmental impact for aquatic life? We have one member that's missing, and she brought up, well, what is the environmental impact to human life? And I don't think either one of those questions have been answered.
And I think one thing, don't forget that 2018 report. The state put exhaustive effort into it and made recommendation. I'm talking about the one that results in the green zones of where to deposit effluent and not. And, you know, it was very articulate. A lot of work went into that. So the assumption that this is okay was in very much difference to that GLO report. And that's what's been bothering me about this location from the beginning, is that we're saying it's like the assumption this is okay, and it's against that recommendation of where the green zones are and the distance offshore. So I see the salinity differences only being several parts per thousand, but as Dr. Paul Zimba, the former director of the Center for Coastal Studies, told me, he says, you know, it's a question of, are you at a tipping point as to whether you affect one part in the food chain that all of a sudden, if that goes out, the rest of them go hungry. So these are difficult questions. I think there's been a lot of good work here, but we are flying in the face of that report.
We have 5 people signed up for next week, right? And then just contact Nick or I if you have questions on that. This item is first up on the individual items, the far-field model, with a relatively short consent agenda, but probably a lot of citizen comment at 12 o'clock, so.
I'll volunteer too,
You know.
if you got room for 6.
What's that?
I'll volunteer to speak to if you ever interested.
Okay, I think we're good. Because we have 5, and we'll wait for Dr. Sharon Dr. Sharon or Dr. Micah the 5th.
Yeah, Peter, I think, I'm not sure I'm going to speak, but I think at this point, we need to reserve a spot for industry also.
Okay. Put down.
And I'll send out information to that group. Maybe we can coordinate ahead of the meeting or just at least gather. It'd be good for us all to sit together. That'd be great.
Okay, that's good.
All right.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.